Yo, welcome to part 6 of the Creepypasta Iceberg by the one and only Fried Pickle Boy. Let's jump right into it. Before we get into this next iceberg tier, I'd like to first introduce today's sponsor for this video, Raid Shadow Legends. Raid Shadow Legends is the first game to bring a true console level experience to your phone. They've set the bar high and there's no going back now. The newest addition to Raid, and my personal favorite, is a legendary champion from the High Elves faction, Deliana. Deliana is one of the strongest support champions in the entire game and can help carry your team to get past many of Raid's tougher challenges. You don't want to miss her. She possesses some great skills and abilities which will be helpful for all players no matter what stage of the game that you're currently in. Raid's currently running a special Deliana Chase event where you can get your hands on the amazing Deliana just by logging in. All you have to do is log in and play Raid for 7 days between now and July 20th, and you'll get Deliana for free. That's it. Deliana can be unlocked by all players so long as you log in on the 7th day of the event. And the gifts keep on coming. For all new players, just enter promo code MyDeliana to get your hands on everything, including 50 XP brews to instantly get your legendary hero, Deliana, to max level 50, as well as a ton of silver. I personally love all the cool and unique champions Raid has on offer, as well as all their unique abilities that help you in being able to have a strategic advantage over the game's many epic boss battles. And there's a ton happening in Raid this month. They've got special events every single day, including an entirely new event for the summer solstice. It's called the Path of Light, and you'll be able to explore 3 branching paths to get the rewards you want the most. On top of that, there's some awesome new champions coming out, and a set of skins for the amazing Trunda Gilt Mallets. They look amazing and I can't wait to get my hands on them. There has never been a better time to get started in Raid, and if you click my link in the description down below, or scan my QR code here on the screen, you'll get unique bonuses worth $30. We're talking a free epic champion, Vergis, 200k silver, 1 energy refill, and 1 XP boost, and 1 ancient shard so you can summon awesome champions as soon as you get in the game. All this treasure will be waiting for you here, and it's that easy. Just click the link in the description and I'll see you in the game. Thank you to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video. And now, on to the spooky stories. This is it. My friend, we have found the center of the island. The Pit o' Pasta. Now you're probably wondering, what the hell do we do from here? Well, you see, there's something I've required for a long time at the very bottom of this molten pasta sauce. Something that means, well, a great deal to me. That's why I'm here. As for you, well, to be honest, I never really asked you why you came along. But I'd hazard to guess you came along for the journey. You probably want me to get back to reading those spooky stories to you out loud. You know, you really are a bit of a weird one. You know that? Well, nonetheless, I'm not judging. You and I are in this together at this point, right? So, let's get our pasta-proof suits on and dive on in. The Case of Stitch Case File Number 56. Starting this tier off, we have one that I had never heard of before and honestly thought it was a totally different creepypasta until I noticed it was a 2.5 hour multi-part pasta. That said, this creepypasta follows two detectives trying to solve a spree of extremely gruesome murders, where the victim seems to be completely torn apart, as if an animal had gotten to them. The start of this pasta, we see our detectives looking over the photos, journals, and security camera footage, is here where they start to notice that in each of the three cases, the victim was acting strangely paranoid and seemed to be under the impression that they were being watched. And then, a bombshell. When they're going over the security camera footage, our protagonist sees that the person killing these people isn't human. It just simply looks like a human, but it's haphazardly stitched together. It has no eyes, and a mouth full of jagged green and black teeth, and it moves unnaturally quick and just unnaturally, period. This is when the two detectives start to hear strange noises outside of both of their houses. They begin to both have terrible dreams, and at some point, they both seem to come clean that this shit is scaring the fucking hell out of them, and move in with one another for the time being. Our protagonist calls the creature Stitch, named after the fact that it's covered in stitches. It's a shame all I can think of is this though, but oh well. Anyway, this goes on for a while, and the story has a pretty comfy vibe in the beginning. I was thoroughly enjoying it, even if the dialogue could be a bit stilted at times. They eventually realize that this creature has been around for decades all across the world, and the very idea of stopping this thing starts to become more and more self-indulgent. How can they stop something supernatural? Something that has been killing people, toying with them, a demon in every sense of the word, for so very long. This is something that they look into as well, and again, I was really enjoying this part of the pasta as well, as the detectives try to fit the puzzle pieces together on just what the hell this strange urban legend creature is. Though they never really commit to one particular creature, but it does sound awfully similar to the rake. But all the same, how do these detectives stop this supernatural entity? Well, the answer is, they kinda don't. Now bear in mind, I'm skipping a lot here because so much happens in this story, from one of the detectives going missing, to the protagonist being accused by the FBI as the main culprit for these murders, since no one really believes him when he says that some fucking monster named Stitch is killing people, to later the monster actively talking and toying with our protagonists. See, once all the mystery of what is killing people is out there, the story kind of shifts to more of a straight-on paranormal hunt pasta, which I thought was an interesting turn of events. After all, you don't often see stories where the detectives, or protagonists in general, go after the weird creepypasta creature, or at least so much so as to try and kill it anyway. It's usually a lot more about the victims of the beast, through happenstance. Though I will say, at about the halfway point of the story, I could tell the author didn't quite know what they wanted to do with the concept they spent several parts establishing, or at the very least was saving some kind of big twist for the end. And by the end, there's this big showdown where our protagonist is in a huge church, and Stitch is toying with the protagonist, taunting him for thinking that he can stop the very idea of fear, the creature seemingly having some sort of connection to biblical demons, but again, never really explained. He also at one point uses a nun as a marionette doll. Again, it's pretty crazy, but if you're into the supernatural, paranormal type stuff, it's still kind of fun. That is, up until the very last part of the pasta. See, the church showdown just ends with our protagonist blacking out and waking up in a hospital. And then, by the next part, he's being taunted by Stitch again. I, as the reader, start to wonder why Stitch doesn't just fucking kill this guy at this point. Maybe he likes watching him suffer, I guess? And then our protagonist can't bear the pain of all the people who have died because he wasn't able to stop this demon, including his partner at this point. So he kills his other partner because he's scared and he wanted to spare him the fear, I guess. And then he commits Exit the Game of Life. And that's how the story ends. Very anticlimactic. I usually always hate at the end of creepypastas when the protagonist exits the game of life by their own hand, because it's just so done to death. And while it can be done very, very well, don't get me wrong, and leave an extremely haunting final note on the story, I notice this often used when the author kind of runs out of ideas and doesn't know what to do with the story anymore. So they end it this way to cheaply get some sort of last shock value out of the reader. This story had potential, and has some decent parts near the start, but ultimately it fumbles the delivery of any of its core ideas, in my opinion. However, this story did remind me of a creepypasta that was somewhat popular way back when, which was actually the creepypasta that I thought this creepypasta was at first glance. Titled, No Reserve, I Just Want It Gone. So this one might take a moment to read, but I feel as though to get the full effect, we should read it in full. So let's jump into it. Quote, the following is the actual text from the auction of the Stitch doll. No reserve, I just want it gone. The following auction is true. I will not be mentioning any names here, as I do not want any of my family or friends to be hounded by people wanting more information. The only one who would know anything other than me would be my fiancé anyway. If anyone has questions, they can be asked of me directly. I please ask that no one try to contact my fiancé, as she has gone through quite enough with this ordeal. Pictures are at the bottom of the page. Okay, I've come to the last thing I can think of to get rid of this cursed thing, but I'll get to that later. Last summer, my fiancé and I were visiting her family in Florida and taking a stop in Disney World. As big fans of the Lilo and Stitch movies, we were interested in buying some Stitch toys. We ended up getting quite a few, of all shapes and sizes. We have had no problem with any of them. They're all regular friggin' teddy bears. One, however, has been a problem since day one. That was the one we picked up on our way from Orlando to Daytona Beach. We stopped at a little out-of-the-way place while looking for a restaurant. This place was small and kind of dingy, but they had food and a gift shop, if you could call it that. I wish I could remember what it's called, but the only thing that seems to ring a bell is Leary. Anyway, they had another Stitch toy there, which looked just as good as what we picked up in Disney World, and was a quarter of the price. The person behind the till seemed a little too pleased to be making the sale. And now I can see why. We visited my fiance's family and flew back home without any incident. We thought we had just had a normal vacation. We displayed the toys on our TV stand with some other stuffed animals my fiance has collected over the years. Nothing has ever moved them, except for when cleaning or dusting, and then they are promptly put back in place. After the new Stitch toys were put up, about once a week we would find one or two of the other stuffed toys on the floor on certain mornings when we would get up. Originally thinking nothing of the fact, we have a dog who we thought maybe bumped the stand. More on him later. We would put the animals back on the stand. This became a semi-regular occurrence until early November, when we awoke to a loud slam in the middle of the night. I got my fiancé to stay upstairs and crept down to see what was happening. I had a light at the top of the stairs, which meant I could not see clearly into the living room to see what had happened, but I did notice different things scattered on the floor. I turned the light on at the front door and saw the items on the floor were actually all of the stuffed animals, the other Stitch toys. The only thing left on our TV stand was the Stitch that we had picked up from that store. That would have been enough, but the top of the TV was cracked as well. It looked as though something heavy had been dropped onto it. We still have no idea what happened there. At this point, I knew that there was something wrong with this toy. So right then and there, I threw it in the garbage in our kitchen cupboard. I put the stuffed animals back as well as I could, and went back up to bed to explain to my fiancé why that Stitch would not be on the shelf when she got up in the morning. Since I didn't want to scare her, I told her it got ripped open when it fell off the shelf, and I had to throw it away, because it looked too bad to repair. Sleep was hard to come by that night. The next day, I got up early, emptied the garbage, and threw it in the dumpster in the parking lot before leaving for work. Problem solved. Or so I thought. Later that morning, I got a call from my fiancé. asking why I thought it would be funny to joke about throwing one of her stuffed toys away. I explained that I put it in the dumpster that morning, and she asked why it was still on the shelf. Both doors were still locked and no windows or anything were broken. I left work early. As soon as I got home, I explained to my fiancée what had happened and told her I was getting rid of the toy. I grabbed it and left and drove out to the Safeway that was a few blocks away. I tossed the thing in the dumpster there and took off for home. Thankfully, that time it didn't come back for 4 days. The strangest thing is that it was clean. It looked as though it had never left the house. Trying to dump the Stitch in different places on the other side of the city, etc., became a regular thing, since no one believed us when we tried to tell the story. There was nothing else we could really do. Thankfully, neither my fiancé nor I were seriously hurt at all. The only injury worth mentioning was it had tripped me, as far as I could tell, as I walked down our front steps one day. I didn't notice it there when leaving the house, and I definitely caught my foot on something. When I turned back, it was there. Thank God I had only scraped my knee and palm. Christmas was thankfully quiet in regards to our problem. Unfortunately, right after the new year, the worst came. I had taken the teddy out to the landfill site just outside the city limits and buried it under any debris I could find close by. It had been close to 3 weeks since we had seen the thing, and we were starting to think that the nightmare was finally over. In an early evening on Tuesday, I let our dog outside, just as we normally do all the time. After he had been outside for about 10 minutes, I thought maybe he had found some food or something to eat, as he usually does. I looked outside and saw him laying in the snow, and he wasn't moving. I ran outside and grabbed him and noticed the Stitch toy laying beside him. Our dog was breathing, but unconscious. I rushed him inside and called the vet. We were able to take him to the emergency clinic, and after examining him, we were told that they could notice nothing actually wrong with him. It appeared as though he had just passed out, but his blood pressure was extremely high, and he was still having problems breathing. They kept him overnight for observation, which was good because I wanted him kept safe as possible. When we got home, we decided to burn the toy in our fireplace, but we couldn't get it to light. We even tried lighter fluid, but as soon as it touched him, it was completely absorbed. He did not feel damp, and he did not smell of the fluid. If we could not burn it, we would incapacitate it. I grabbed a pair of scissors to cut off each of its arms and legs and head. I then took the 6 pieces, put them in a garbage bag, tied the top, and put it outside on the front step to get rid of it in the morning. The next morning I went outside to get the Stitch, and the bag was gone. I could not find it anywhere in our yard or the parking lot. I went back inside and there it was. The toy was back on the TV stand and it looked like it had never been touched. Not a speck of dirt, not a rip or tear on it. I grabbed the toy, ran to the car, went downtown, and ran into the first pawn shop I could find. The owner said they did not take used stuffed toys, as they could be dirty. I told him that he could have it for free. I just did not want it. He started to ask why, but I left it on the counter and ran out of the store, and thought maybe if someone else were to buy it, it would stay with them and away from us. February was a great month. Our dog was healthy, and my fiancé and I were able to sleep peacefully, as the Stitch was nowhere to be seen. I felt bad that maybe we had put the curse on someone else, but sometimes you have to do what you have to do. 2 days ago, it came back. I opened the front door to go to work Monday morning, and it was sitting on the front step, facing me. I put it in the house, pinned it under our TV, and told my fiancé about it, and to leave the house as fast as possible. After discussing what to do for a few days, we have decided that we really have no other option than to try and list it on eBay and get it as far away from ourselves as possible. We do not want to send it to someone who is not expecting it, and we want to send it to someone who is asking for it. This is why the opening bid is for 1 cent, and there is no reserve. We just want to get rid of it. Thankfully, it has stayed under the TV up until now, with no real signs of change. I don't want to sound like a wuss, but this bear is the scariest thing I have ever experienced, and I am a horror fanatic. It may look like a regular stuffed toy, but it's evil. Please, if you have children or pets, think twice before bidding. This is not a toy for a child. I cannot say with assurance that you will have the same experiences as us, but there is a strong likelihood that you will see what I mean, and I do not want to feel any guilt for harm coming to a child or an animal. We also cannot guarantee that the item will stay with you after you've received it. If it stays as persistent as it has previously, it may try to get back to us. I will not be putting a return address on the package, as if when you realize that the item is evil, as I'm sure you will, I do not want you sending it back to us. It will become your responsibility as soon as it enters your possession. The buyer is to pay for shipping in whatever form they would like. I can dismember the item before shipping as well, if you feel safer that way. But I cannot guarantee it will arrive in this form. If you would like the toy shipped without being cut up, I will attempt to immobilize it with either duct tape or rope, or a combination of the two. It is your choice. Payment accepted for this auction is PayPal only. I do this because I do not want the winning buyer to have my address, for the same reason listed above. Again, I have to warn that if you have children or pets, please think about what you are bidding on. We are not responsible for anything that happens after this item leaves our possession. The pictures below are as follows. There is an image of the Stitch, as it is now, trapped under the TV. There's a picture of the top of the TV, where it was damaged previously. The last picture is of an old picture we took after we had finished decorating, showing where the Stitch was sitting with the other stuffed toys. It is the second from the right. Serious bidders only, please. I do not want to have to keep this for any longer than I have to. 10 days for the auction is already pushing it, but I want it to actually be sold, so I need as many people to see it as possible. If you have less than 20 feedback, please let me know you are serious before bidding. Lastly, if you have any questions, please ask. Thank you. Unquote. So yeah, this was an actual eBay auction. And while obviously you can make up any story you want on eBay, it is also a super cool way of telling a scary story. Once again, using the internet, or in this case eBay, as a means of telling a scary story. Even attaching an item that I'm assuming you could have actually bought to connect with said scary story, even if the item is probably just a regular ass Stitch toy. Now mind you, it is sort of an old creepy doll tale, and I'm sure that we are all very familiar with. I don't cover it on this iceberg, but it kind of reminds me of the Robert the Doll tale, which again is also based on a supposed true story with an actual doll that you can see. But bear in mind, this was posted all the way back in 2005, and for its time was at the very least a very unique way of sharing this type of story. It's also yet another good showcase for what early creepypastas were all about. These strange stories that almost seem like they could be real. Maybe. Possibly. But of course, are not. But they are at the very least presented in this fashion. The author trying to sell you the tale. But anyway, that's more than enough Stitch-related stories for now. Beast in the night. Sometimes I can hear it pacing around my bed. He's kinda in a hurried motion, as if he had more than 2 feet. Which he doesn't. I know because sometimes I catch a glimpse of him. He looks a bit anorexic, if he's even human. For all I know, he could have been buff for his kind. If there is any more of his kind, God, I hope not. His mouth is wider than anything I have ever seen. I think he either broke his jaw or has no jaw. Another thing that doesn't help the fact is that his large gaping hole of a mouth is occupied by 2 beady eyes with black skin surrounding them. Another thing that I know is that he is blind. I once met his eyes, but he turned as if I wasn't there. I try to meet his eyes a lot, but I get no response. What makes up for his loss of eyesight is his sensitive hearing. Once my cat jumped off the couch, and the beast heard it from my room. He bolted out of my room, and then silence. The next day, my cat was found dead in the backyard. They all thought a coyote or a stray dog had killed it. I could only make out a huge, human-like bite mark under its torso. He had killed it. He had to have. I've never seen anything that could have made a bite so large. All I could say is that the coyote could not have possibly created such a huge bite. Tonight was a different night. I had to sneeze, and I did, but the pillow muffled it. I didn't think he noticed. He just turned and scratched my closet door. At least, that's what I thought he was doing. After a while, it seemed as if he was writing something. To my amazement, he was. I started freaking out once I lost sight of him in the darkness. The only thing that calmed me was the complete silence. My pupils dilated as I could see in the dark. I saw the corner where he once crept to, and he wasn't there. And then I heard at the foot of my bed a growl like an angered dog's growl. My heart sunk deep into my chest. My heart rate must have slowed down a lot. Even after this, I dare not move. As it crawled slowly closer to my face, I read its message carved into my closet door. I heard you. Necrosis. This is yet another experiment-type creepypasta, this time taking place in the 80s when a group of scientists go to Africa to research a strange new disease that they eventually dub the Wendigo Complex, in which strange spores seem to infect people. Wounds on their body have a bulbous muscle growth over them, and ultimately, they will eventually die. Well, except they don't, because then they become the living dead, and yeah, it's basically a zombie outbreak origin story. It's a pretty good one though, and eventually finds our very narrator getting infected with the disease, with the final few journal notes being his slow descent into madness about it. But yeah, not much more to say about this one other than it's pretty decent. Boothworld Industries. So this one's pretty interesting, primarily because it started a whole trend of people calling the number attached to the pasta, and even managed to create several copycat type stories as well. The actual story focuses on our protagonist who is answering a phone call from the plumber, and when he answers the call, a strange chime plays and a woman tells him, quote, "Welcome to Boothworld Industries. My name is Samantha, and I will be your operator today. Name?" unquote. Our protagonist seems to be rather confused by this, but through a back and forth conversation, he eventually tells them his name and then gives them the name of his ex-girlfriend, Jessica Goodwin. Quote, "I could hear clicking of a keyboard on the other end of the phone. It sounded like the woman was pounding the thing with her fists. After a few moments of this, she returned. Jessica Goodwin, she said. Remodeling is scheduled for August 21st of 2015. Would you like to reschedule?" I was silent on my side of the phone. I could not believe this. Someone had to be playing a prank on me. "Who is this? Is this you, Jessica? Are you playing a prank on me?" I asked. The woman didn't respond for a long time. I thought that whoever was on the other end of the phone was holding in a laugh. "Hello?" I asked. "Yes or no, sir?" the woman asked back. "Yes?" I said, not understanding what the woman was asking. I have a Tuesday appointment available. Will that work? At this point, I thought I was going insane and that it actually was the plumbing company. What about today? I asked. Do you have anything available for today? Normally, we can't arrange for a reschedule on such short notice, but today we had a cancellation. How does 3 o'clock work for you? 3 o'clock is fine, I said. 3 o'clock it is then. Would you like a courtesy call? Sure. Wonderful. We at Boothworld Industries say thanks and welcome to the club. You have a marvelous day. That strange chord played twice again, and then the line went dead. I rolled my eyes and went back to unpacking. My phone rang at 3 o'clock on the dot that afternoon. Hello, I said. Sir, this is Samantha with Boothworld Industries again. Your courtesy call begins now. What do you... I began to say, but was cut off by those diminished chords blaring into my ear. Then I heard Jessica's voice. Why are you doing this? Jessica asked. I could hear the tears in her voice. Jessica? I asked. Sir, the operator said. She cannot hear you. This is a courtesy call. The appointment has already been concluded. Please, Jessica begged. Please don't do this. I'll do anything you want. Jessica's voice choked off into a wheeze, and all I could hear on the other end of the phone was the rustling of clothing and more wheezing. Eventually it stopped and someone picked up on the other end. The scheduled work has been completed, a man's voice said. We at Boothworld Industries say thanks and welcome to the club. You have a marvelous day. Sir, the operator came back on the line. Was that to your satisfaction? I sat there for a long time, cold sweat dripping down my ribcage. Jessica was my ex, because I walked in on her and my best friend fucking at a party in high school. I smiled and whispered, That was perfect. Wonderful, the operator said. We at Boothworld Industries aim to serve. Would you like to make another appointment? As I stared at the water leaking from the door of the dishwasher, I smiled even bigger. Yes, I said. Yes, I would. Unquote. So basically, the service that Boothworld Industries provides is an elaborate hitman company, something which they refer to as remodeling. Now after that part of the story, when our protagonist tries to set up another remodeling, Boothworld Industries notes that they can't schedule at the time he requested, since his remodeling will be happening before then. He asks if there is a way for them to reschedule his remodeling, to which they reply that he'll need to invite 1,000 new members, something which this very story is meant to do, as he also provides the phone number for becoming a member and putting a hit out on someone, which funnily enough, for a time actually worked, as seen here.
Still ringing.
You have reached Boothworld Industries. Your number has been lost and traced. A service representative will be with you shortly for a phone. We at Boothworld Industries say thanks. You have a marvelous day.
Whoa. Okay. Now, I got to say, the person who invented this creepypasta, I'm gonna give you props, or whatever, whoever has this number, because I don't know if you could hear the message, but it said, "Thank you for calling Boothworld Industries. Your number has been traced, and a representative will call you back shortly." Wow, okay, that's kind of freaky.
You have reached Boothworld Industries. Your number has been lost and traced. A service representative will be with you shortly for remodeling. We at Boothworld Industries say thanks. You have a marvelous day.
Hi, I would like to make an appointment if you can just call me back. Thanks.
Yeah, this poster writer went above and beyond by actually having this number lead to a creepy answering machine, something which several YouTubers at the time called for fun. It goes without saying none of it was real, but it was a fun and fairly creepy concept to be able to read about and then actually call and hear someone actually pick up. What's more is the author of the story once in a while would actually call back the people who called the number, which is some real dedication, and I imagine it was pretty fucking freaky for a fair few who called in not expecting that at all. Though, I will note that the way the story is written makes it seem like the guy who was making the appointment was like playing really dumb or confused, which doesn't make sense since he clearly knows what it is actually doing, what Boothworld Industries is, and what his goal was later on in the story. It was kind of written in a purposely dumb way so that there could be a big twist at the end, which I'm not really a fan of that. If you're gonna write a story that way, you need to actually, like, be better at writing it, as in make it so if you read the story back again, it actually makes sense, like what he's saying could be interpreted a completely different way so that the twist makes sense. But having read this at least twice now, nothing implies that he knows what he's fucking doing until he randomly does at the very end. But hey, the idea of a hitman hotline that you could actually call was at least still pretty cool, so there's that. The real Chuck E. Cheese. This pasta opens with the following paragraph. Quote, "Have you ever thought that there was something the creators of Chuck E. Cheese were hiding something from us all? Or have you ever found something to be off about the place? Even the creepy robotic mascots that danced on stage? I didn't until I found out the truth about Chuck E. Cheese. It all began on the first time I ever visited the place. I was around the age of 5 or 6, so of course, I was pretty ecstatic to go." Unquote. You know, things are really starting off well when there's a mistake within the very first sentence. Have you ever thought that there was something the creators of Chuck E. Cheese were hiding something from us all? Atrocious. Bad grammar aside, what follows is a tale about a 5 or 6-year-old as he plays around the Chuck E. Cheese until he hears a strange voice coming from the staff-only door say, "Test 15 on mutated rat results in angered behavior, such as throwing desk and scientist at the wall." And, "What are we going to do with this beast?" And, "Get away from me!" Well, eventually the staff realize this kid is listening in on them and pulls him into the room, saying, you know, over and over again. Eventually, the strange beast that they're panicking about gets loose and starts killing staff members. Our protagonist is able to escape it by running through an air vent and eventually makes his way back to his mom, and they get the hell out of there. Later, there's a news report about some sort of mutated rat seen running away from the scene of the crime, that being a bunch of mutilated staff members. Our protagonist doesn't seem to know what the hell is going on, but he vows to never again go to a Chuck E. Cheese, and to never listen in on the staff. The end. So yeah, pretty short, and pretty lackluster at that too. Like, almost as soon as he gets to the Chuck E. Cheese, he's then being pulled into this scary scenario, and just as soon gets out of it. So this whole story feels pretty rushed, and far less than half-baked. We're working with straight-ass raw dough here. I guess the real Chuck E. Cheese is a mutated rat, and now he's on the loose. Ooh, scary. But speaking of Chuck E. Cheese, the truth behind Chuck E. Cheese. This one's a little bit better than the last one, as it follows our narrator, a fella who's in desperate need of a job, and so applies for one of his local Chuck E. Cheese. Strangely enough, the manager of this joint, John, hires him without question, or needing any background info on him, something which takes our narrator by surprise. He's later told that his job will be to clean up the tables, floors, and all the animatronics. John tells him that the animatronics can act oddly at times, almost going haywire, and if that should occur, he should spray them with a bottle of what looked to be water. Our protagonist feels this whole situation is rather curious, especially when he goes to clean the animatronics at first time and finds that they are all perfectly clean. As would be expected after all, why would they need to be constantly cleaned? What would possibly get them so dirty? Well, that is until he reaches the Chucky one, which has a mess on its face and mouth in particular. he notices that it looks more realistic than the other animatronics. It had a much softer texture to it as well. After he got finished cleaning it, it opens its mouth wide and stares at our narrator, but does nothing else after. While he nearly shits his pants over this, he checks it up to being one of those strange haywire things John noted before. However, a stranger part of his job was that after he was finished cleaning the animatronics, he was to stay put in the same room as them until he was told to go home, which he is never told for what purpose. He is eventually let out and goes home, but that night he wakes up to the sound of high-pitched laughter outside of his window. Later on the next day, he once again has to clean up the animatronics, but this time when he waits for someone to come and tell him to go home, no one comes. In fact, it gets to be 10 p.m. by the time our narrator finally just leaves the room and notices most of the lights are turned off in the joint and everyone's gone. There wasn't even an animatronic show today. What was the point of him watching them all this time? Our narrator, rather peeved and starting to freak out, goes home once again, planning to leave that job the next morning. He is, however, once again awoken by the sound of laughter outside his bedroom window. This time, however, he checks his window and is immediately startled by the animatronic, or maybe at least someone wearing the Chuck E. Cheese mascot suit, standing right outside the window. He falls backwards in fear, and by the time he's gotten back up, the rat is gone. He figures this must have been an elaborate prank by the people who hired him for that job, that must be why they didn't do a background check or anything, that it was all some sort of elaborate fucked up prank. But then, why him? He marches out the next morning to Chuck E. Cheese to give them a piece of his mind, but then he sees, when he gets there, police tape and cop cars all around the building. He asks the police what happened here, and they tell him someone stole the Chuck E. Cheese animatronic, which, is props pretty expensive, but I'm pretty sure they don't set up police tape and get several police cars involved for someone stealing a fucking fur-covered robot, but whatever, I guess. At any rate, the story ends with our narrator being alone once again in his house when he hears the laughing again, and so this time he calls the cops. And it's then when he sees the Chuck E. Cheese animatronic in the corner of his room, mouth agape and ready to rip the flesh from his bones. He quickly jumps out his window and runs like hell. The police later come to visit his home, and he tells them someone in a Chuck E. Cheese suit tried to kill him with a knife, knowing full well they wouldn't believe what actually happened, but figured that info was good enough for them to investigate the Chuck E. Cheese establishment. When they do, they discover that John the manager is nowhere to be seen, and that there is a room full of dead, torn apart teenagers, all of them being previously missing case victims in the local area. Our narrator finally noting that he fears for the fact that that thing, whatever it is still out there, and that sometimes, late into the night, he can hear just barely the faint sound of a high-pitched laughter. The end. And that's the story of the truth behind Chuck E. Cheese. Like I said, it's a bit better than the last one, and while it has several issues, I'd overall say it's at least a more interesting read. It is kind of a fun twist that the animatronic eats teenagers that work there and not the kids or something like that. We never really get to know what John's connection is to all this though, besides the fact that he's at least aware that this shit is happening. It's also not clear what exactly the Chuck E. Cheese monster is either. Animatronic gone haywire? Guy in a mascot suit? Maybe John is a real anthro-furry-ass Chuck E. Cheese. Maybe he's like fucking the purple guy from fucking FNAF and he's like putting on an animatronic suit. I don't fucking know. Who knows? All I do know is that if you thought the truth behind Chuck E. Cheese was enlightening as to the true, darker truth of Chuck E. Cheese, then what comes next will truly blow your mind. Shock you, even. The Chuck E. Cheese shocking truth. Why the fuck do all these Chuck E. Cheese creepypastas have titles like The Real Chuck E. Cheese, The Truth Behind Chuck E. Cheese, The Shocking Truth of Chuck E. Cheese? I don't fucking know, but there is definitely a bit of a a naming convention to these, isn't there? They're all about a grand conspiracy or truth being revealed, which so far has just been that Chuck E. Cheese is apparently a real monster mutant rat that eats people, or is an animatronic that eats people. But what about this one? Well, it starts with the following paragraph. Quote, I'm a huge Chuck E. Cheese fanatic. I use the sites under the name Cheese Fan 101. I used to work there. I still have the Pascal outfit in the closet, along with several plastic spiders and Coca-Cola souvenir cups and a big old bucket of plastic pasta that cost 6,000 tickets. Unquote. Now I want you to remember this paragraph, that this dude is a huge Chuck E. Cheese fan and owns several pieces of merch and used to go to fucking fan sites under the name of Chuck E. Cheese Fan 101. So clearly this is a man who loves this kid's arcade pizza establishment, right? Well, the next paragraph opens like this. Quote, there's something you should know. I worked at that place from 1995 to 1997, when things took a strange turn for the worse. Indeed, the cheese, as we call it in the biz, is not at all what it's cracked up to be. Eggs, listen carefully, because I don't want to frighten you. I know you're easily scared, and this story is easily going to make you lose your sanity, because of how much has been covered up by the Chuck E. Cheese Corporation over the years. Unquote. It's at this point that I'm starting to think the story might be a troll pasta. The line, I know you're easily scared, and that this story is easily going to make you lose your fucking sanity, is either one of the worst genuine lines I've read in a creepypasta, or one of the better joke lines I've read in a troll pasta. Also, eggs? Yes? What the fuck is eggs, period? What the fuck is that? What was he talking about? What? Okay, but moving on. The story goes on to follow our strange narrator, who after being hired back in 1995, then goes on to describe the training video that he was shown upon entry into his new job. Quote, I first knew something was off when I saw the training video. The man never took the Pascal outfit off, and I never broke character. It was really weird. A character named P. Farnabas Q. Cheese was seen in the background, but he never interacted, nor were they ever included in the original Cheese lineup. Later, Munch, the large purple what's-it word, replaced P. Farnabas, who I believe was deemed too weird for American audiences. Chuck E. Cheese originated in Canada. Now you probably don't know that Chuck E. Cheese was created by the guy who invented Pong. This is important, but I want you to remember that for now. Later on you'll understand everything. The training room was fine. A little cold. Pascal was shown baking up the pizza and telling us how to cook it. Be sure to butter it up with our special butter sauce. Muy buen. Pascal costume kissed his plastic lips, the head looking a little bit off. I could go for a whole bit pie of that cheesy cheese pizza right about now. His head turned a little. And I noticed that the Chuck E. Cheese logo, which usually contained a little rat giving a thumbs up, had a small Masonic symbol on it. I didn't know Chucky was a Mason. The training video was really long. They showed us how to prepare the dough, make the sauce, and put the piping hot pizza in the oven. And be sure to cook the pizza! Always use a glove! Pascal winked, a sinister wink. I was getting a strange feeling. Otherwise, this may happen, and the Chuck won't like that. Pascal Costin reached into the piping hot oven with his bare hands, taking out the pizza, screaming violently. Oh my fucking god! He yelled, and there was a weird CG laugh stapled on. He had visible blisters on his hands. His red and burning hands were not puppet hands. They were human hands. I can't cook pizza this way, he screams. My art is ruined! He takes out a knife and begins to slice off his own arm at the wrist. The training tape immediately cut to a bunch of kids playing in the ball pit, as if that never happened. Then Chucky began to talk. You know, remember, don't play on the machines until after dark. What the hell did that mean? Oh, You can play bouncy gyrocopter or horse rider for $0.25, but nothing's gonna cure that deep depression when you're too old to take a ride anymore. Unquote. The story goes on like that for a bit until later our narrator notes that, quote, This is too weird for me, but they made us sign a non-disclosure agreement before we became part of the Chuck E. Cheese family. That was the weirdest part. They had me take a blood test. Not a drug test, like a normal employer, but a blood test. I was thinking about that in the last few minutes of the training video, when Chuck yelled, "Cheesy blood! Cheesy blood!" He spurted a blood pack all over the pizza and walked out of the kitchen with it. Unquote. When our narrator notes how they are serving the pizzas with blood on them, wondering if this was supposed to be some kind of joke, the store's manager just notes that they do things differently in Canada. But the cheese foundation is all American, which I have no fucking idea what that means, but sure. Our narrator is told to come back tomorrow and everything will be sorted out, even though all they did was watch a training video, so I'm not sure what is needing to be sorted out. It was all at this point I was getting pretty fucking confused with this pasta. Later, when our narrator gets home, he has a nightmare, because, I mean, of course he does, about the manager of the Chuck E. Cheese putting blood in the pizza for some Masonic ritual. This makes our protagonist determined to know the truth behind this Chuck E. Cheese restaurant. I guess. And, I'm just gonna fucking read it. Quote, I was gonna have to do it. I was going to break into Chuck E. Cheese and finally figure out what the hell is going on. I got a black night suit, some goggles, and a pair of non-slip sole shoes. While I was breaking and entering, the pizza kitchen was quite greasy in the late hours, and I didn't want to trip and fall. I jimmied the lock using a small knife, some fish bones, and a rubber hammer. I climbed through the window anyway, worried that there may be a security system. A red laser grid wired protected the floor. This seemed like a law of security to protect a bunch of cheap souvenirs in the skee-ball games. Or so I thought. Or so I got really confused at what I was looking at. I went into the back closet, being careful not to trip the wires. I found it behind Ruben's desk. The big quarter! I picked it up and silently crept over to the other side of the room. The quarter was heavy and had burn marks all over it. Why the hell would the Chuck E. Cheese Corporation mint something like this? I saw a slot back behind the wall. I put it in. All the machines turned on immediately. All their eyes began to move in unison. The entire thing was lit up at once. You could probably see it from miles away. The car rides honked. The slot machines rolled. The animatronic puppets began to dance at a rigorous pace, as though they were going to break. I took up my screwdriver and began to unscrew the machine. The chicken machine! My favorite game. I unscrewed the 4 main screws and popped the top off. What I saw next shocked me to my very core of my being. I will never forget it. To my horror, there was a dead Chuck E. Cheese employee inside. Wait, not dead, moving! The lips were sewn shut, and it had a horrified expression on its face. It was hooked to an IV that fed him intravenous pieces of food that were attached to the ink on the ticket machine. What in God's name? The words, ut in honestis sacrifice queso, were burned into his chest. I later found out that meant an honorable sacrifice to the cheese. The other machines started to knock and bang. There were people in all of them, stuffed inside. I didn't have the chance to save them because something happened next that truly terrified me. The characters, they were human. I know what you're thinking. It's just a suit. It wasn't a suit. That was their skin. A furry rat man walked out with a crooked nose and hobbly, warped teeth. He looked sinister with his cap. Wasn't even fitting. The real Chuck E. Cheese had arrived, and he was covered in ugly, patchy fur for his oblong kneecap and bulging dough chunk gut. Pascal, too, the Italian man, leered at me angrily, holding a ladle covered in what I hoped to God was just pasta sauce. And the others, Jasper T. Jowls, a crying dog face whose skin looked like a worn-out leather shoe. His banjo was missing strings and his suit was ill-fitting. Helen Henry, whose bloody chicken wings had glued on its own feathers and sewn off beak, and Mr. Munch, whose fur was strong and thick that you could barely see anything but his oversized glossy human eyes, blood on his purple whiskers, and when he opened his mouth, an endless gullet filled with all kinds of esophageal bacteria that clung to the sides of his sickly skin. He leered at me with a kind of look. "Please the cheese," he said. "Please the cheese." They began to corner me, and I was hit with a ladle square on the head. The police arrived. I had tripped the wire. Good. I was about to blow the cover of this whole fucking thing. Thank God, officer, they're real oh God. The officer. The cop was wearing a Chuck E. Cheese costume. He pulled a gun on me and led me back to the police car. Unquote. I have no fucking words. But, I think we should definitely read this final quote, which I'm pretty sure confirms this has to be a troll pasta, because if it's not, we have contender for probably one of the worst creepypastas ever written. Quote, "They put me in cheese jail." They put me in cheese jail, a place where bad employees are forced to watch crappy reruns of that shitty show they show on the screen. I was allowed to eat pizza dough chunks and baconaise, a form of bacon-flavored mayonnaise. After 8 years, they let me go, but by then it was too late. The Chuck E. Cheese had closed down, replaced by a bowling alley and all evidence removed. To think that the Cheese Corporation would bind employees to the floor and force-feed them tickets, all so that they could save a few dollars on their electric bill. Or maybe it's not that at all. Maybe I'm just some crazy guy on the internet, huh? Just some crazy guy making up stories about a pizza restaurant for children. I fucking dare you to go open one of those machines right now. They say the Palm Crater went nuts in his final years. All those infinite hours of bouncing the ball until he finally lost it. They say he started a pizza chain because he wanted to create the first human AI, that he failed. And the only way he could compromise was by starting a cheese-based religion that required real intelligence. Living flesh machines. Just put a man in a rat suit, feed them pizza, some flashing lights, and they'll show up in droves, he said. He was right. The end. So, yeah, that was probably the most dumbass creepypasta I have ever fucking read. But I'm at least 99% sure it was meant to be that way. So, I guess mission accomplished. If it is somehow actually a real genuine attempt though, that was some distinctly bad writing. Especially since after all that, and the big overdramatic speech at the end, you gotta remember, it all started with, "I'm a Chuck E. Cheese fan, I go by Cheese Fan 101. So it all just adds to this sandwich of pure nonsense. Oh, and while we're on the topic of all these Chuck E. Cheese creepypastas, which trust me, if I wanted to, I could make the rest of this tier bonus entries based entirely on this robot rat. Another pasta group that there's a fair few creepypastas around that were made back in the day was for Five Nights at Freddy's, of which I won't be reading any of them here because while many did appear on video game creepypasta wikis, I feel like so many of them hedge a little too close to just straight up fan fiction for my liking. And from what I remember, they aren't anything to write home about anyway, but I figured I'd mention it here while we're talking about all these animatronic-based creepypastas. Anyway, that's enough cheese cult-related stories for my liking. What's next? The Intestines. Quote, "You wake up not knowing where you are or what your name is. There's a sign saying, 'Trust your intestine.' Then an intestine drops from the ceiling, from an open vent that you could fit through, so you climb through, which you will soon regret. Just when you think you escaped, you fall through an air vent into a pile of what you think is goo. Suddenly the goo transforms into a goo monster. You back-eye knot a wall, and he gets closer and closer. Just as he opens his enormous, foul-smelling mouth, You hear a deafening screech and cover both of your ears. A naked dog-like creature with wings flies into the room and attacks the blob, and faces you and talks and whispers into your ear saying, "We are what you see when you die. We torture you, rip parts of you out, and eat your soul. The only way to escape is to trust your intestine." The creature rips your intestine out, and then you wake up, safe and sound in your room, but still don't remember who you are. You hear what you think is wind, but it gets heavier and heavier until you cover your ears and look at a table next to your bed and see an intestine with a note saying, "Remember, I told you," and then you slowly fall asleep. The next day, you ask your neighbors what your name is and who you are. Your name is Joshua. Your parents died in a car crash and you live alone and work at McDonald's from Monday to Friday, 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. You wonder how they know oh my god, you wonder how they know that much about you and go back inside your house. That night, you dream the same dream, but you remember who you were, and instead of ripping your intestine out, the creature brings you intestable and reos it open, and there is a note saying, "I am coming tomorrow, so beware." You continue the day normally and think a dream is just a dream, nothing's gonna happen, but the moment the doorbell rings, so you go to the curtain closet of the door and open it, you see the creature, but it is even more horrifying. He has red eyes, his flesh was ripped of, and his wings were broken. You ran up to your room and locked the door. Just then you remember that the creature he broke the intestine, so with all of your strength you ripped open the intestine, but there were words saying "no way out." The creature knocked down the door and ripped your intestine out and said, "Go to sleep." You woke up with a fright and was relieved it was all just a dream. Then you had the pain in the stomach. You look down and find your stomach ripped open and your intestine gone, and you collapse and die. News report: boy of the name Joshua has died unexpectedly with no signs of damage. All his limbs are intact except his intestine, which was found on his neck, saying, "Trust your intestine." The end. Why don't we just take a little commercial break, huh? Never Again. This one is yet again a very short pasta and follows a 70-year-old boy who is constantly abused by his bitch-faced mother. Well, one night he sees a strange-looking little girl on his living room couch. She's pale and covered in dirt and has feet all blue and green in color. He asks her who she is, to which she replies, "Lacey Morgan." Seeing how cold and scared she looked, he tells her she can stay the night and gets an old Afghan for her. When our protagonist wakes up the next morning, he gets a coffee mug shoved into his shoulder by his mother, who is angry that there's dirt all over the couch. The little girl seemed to have been completely gone. He takes responsibility rather than uselessly explain to her, and gets a powerful slap on the cheek for it. It's then later at school that he hears something that sends a shiver down his spine. Quote, "Lacey Morgan was found dead last night. I passed the day waiting for any more news on the subject, but found none." Upon arriving home, the news was broadcasting a live report on her though. Lacey Morgan, 6 years of age, was reported dead at 7 last night. Her body was located in the backyard, buried there in her pink dress. So far, there has been no sign of her mother, Marissa Morgan, who is suspected to be the killer. Marissa has reportedly abused Lacey multiple times and may be responsible for her death. Suddenly, a picture of Lacey appeared on the screen. She appeared very close to how she had when I met her. Blonde hair in braids, pink dress, pale face. Only her cheeks had color, and her eyes were baby blue. To most, this would seem unimportant, but to me it was. She died before arriving at my home. If what the newscaster said was true, died hours before, unquote. Later that same night, our protagonist wakes up to the sensation of cool fingers on his cheek, and a voice which whispered, "Never again." It was Lacey, and within the next 10 minutes, he heard his mother screaming. Quote, "My mom was thrashing wildly on her bed. a small creature having buried its face into her chest. I could hear the sound of flesh tearing, and my mother's screaming increased in volume. I wished I hadn't gotten up. Later on, I'd tell myself I hadn't, but I had. So when Lacey pulled back from the gaping hole in my mother's chest cavity, I had a plain view of her razor-sharp teeth, glistening in the light, glinting with my mother's blood. She smiled innocently at me for a moment, before swiftly tearing out my mother's jugular. That time, I did faint. When I awoke, I was in my bed. I walked to my mom's room, morbid curiosity getting the best of me. Upon opening the door, I found the room empty, the bed made neatly, as if my mom had left for work early. The only oddities were the dirty child footprints and the open window, showing that Lacey had in fact visited. I never saw my mother again, and I never really missed her either. I eventually got married, and we had a child together. I named her Lacey. Recently, I noticed the neighbor's daughter has all sorts of scrapes and bruises on her arms. I've started watching their home, and the other day I saw something odd. A little girl running barefoot through their backyard up to their back door. It was around midnight, so I couldn't be for sure. But I thought she met my eyes with her black ones, and I could swear that she mouths two words to me: never again, unquote. And that's the story of Never Again, and it's pretty decent. I do think it could have been a bit longer and have more build up to that last paragraph, since I think it has some pretty decent bones. But as it is, it's just kind of a okay little scary revenge type story. But I see the potential for something a lot more. But, I mean, what can you do? Doors. Now this one is truly a classic. One of my personal favorites for having one of the most effective twist endings that I've seen in a creepypasta scene. But with that said, what's the story about? Well, it's a fairly short one, and honestly, I feel like I cannot quite do this one justice without reading it in full, so let's get to it then. Quote, I was adopted. I never knew my real mother. Rather, I knew her at one time, but I left her side when I was too little to be able to remember. I loved my adoptive family, though. They were so kind to me. I ate well, lived in a warm and comfortable house, and got to stay up pretty late. Let me tell you about my family real fast. First, there's my mother. I never called her mom or anything like that. I just called her by her first name, Janice. She didn't mind at all, though. I called her that for so long, I don't think she even noticed. Anyhow, she was a very kind woman. I think that she is the one who recommended my adoption in the first place. Sometimes I would lay my head against her in front of the television and would tickle my back with her nails. She was one of those Hollywood mothers. Second, there's Dad. His real name is Richard, but he never really liked me much, so I began to refer to him as Dad in a desperate attempt to gain his affection. It didn't work. I think that no matter what I called him, he would never love me as much as his own child. That's understandable, so I really didn't press the matter. The most notable attribute of my dad was his unmoving sternness. He was not afraid to pop his children when they did something wrong. I found that out before I could use the restroom properly. He didn't hesitate to spank me. Well, I'm in line, and it's because of his methods, I suppose. Lastly is my sister. Little Emily was really young when I was adopted, so we were about the same age, but she was slightly older. I like to think of her as my little sister, though. We got along better than any siblings could possibly get along. We would always stay up late together and just talk. Well, she did a lot of the talking. I mostly just listened because I loved her. It was a great setup that we had. We were short on bedrooms, so because I didn't want to sleep in the living room by myself when I was littler, I had a pallet set up for me next to her bed on the floor. This is where I have slept since. But it was cool with me because I enjoyed being with her, and I had always felt pretty protective of my little sis. Everything changed on a horrible Wednesday night. I was at home taking a nap when little Emily opened the front door. The sound of the door opening pulled me to a state of consciousness, and I walked from the room down the hall to the living room. That's when I first remembered it was Wednesday. I was never any good with keeping track of what day it was. Actually, I'll just go ahead and say it. My sense of time was horrible. But, nevertheless, I knew it was Wednesday because Emily had just come home from her church's youth group gathering. She walked in the front door and hugged me, and then was followed in by Dad and Janice. "You have a good nap?" Janice said teasingly as she ruffled up my hair. I just shook my head and away and snorted in a manner that clearly expressed that I was teasing back with her. "Don't you snort at your mother like that," said my father gruffly, with authority, shut the door behind him and hung up his coat. I was clearly joking, I growled under my breath. He must not have heard me because I didn't feel him smack me. Emily then proceeded to our room and I followed. She started telling me about her day. You know, usual teenage girl stuff. But I listened so that she would feel better. After her summary, she suggested watching TV and I obliged and jumped onto the couch as she was going for the remote. She rolled her eyes at my little brother-like immaturity and scooted me over and sat down. The TV turned on and we watched it together until the sun went down. Emily was the kind of girl that instead of watching cartoons and soap operas, would rather watch Discovery and Animal Planet and National Geographic. I liked those too, so I didn't mind. Actually, those were the only channels that could hold my attention. So it got late and Janice walked up behind the sofa. "Emily, it's past your bedtime. Turn off the television and go up to your room. You too," she pointed at me. Emily turned off the program we were watching grudgingly and stood up. She started down the hallway to our room. As I followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We went into our room and Emily turned off the light. Just as she did, I caught a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. It was out the window, but as soon as I directed my line of sight to where the window was, no longer in my peripheral vision, what it was I thought I saw was gone. I still remained alert, for my sister's sake. I laid there in the darkness with nothing but a thin ray of light from the street lamp outside to illuminate the room. It wasn't much. Time and time again, I could have sworn that I heard subtle sounds just out the window. A twig breaks, leaves crunching, clothes jostling, and all the while I could smell the faint stench of sweat and blood. I kept my eyes open most of the night. The sounds outside subsided and the smell left my nose. I began to feel at ease. My eyelids closed. Not long after, I heard a very loud crash on the other side of the house. I was up in an instant. "There's someone in the house!" I barked with extreme adrenaline coursing through me. "Wake up!" I shrilly pleaded at Emily. She did, and as soon as I saw her sit up, I ran to my parents' room. Dad was dead. His neck was splayed open and gaping as blood spilled out of it, off the bed, and onto the floor. I saw that the master bathroom's door was closed, and just before it on the outside was a man. A man I don't feel comfortable calling it that. He was very large and rugged. He turned around and saw me, and that's when I saw him accurately for the first time. I won't forget it. His eyes were large and beady and trapped with lust. He was styling a beard that was badly unkempt, with blood dripping off. His clothes were dirty and his face was cold. Just then I noticed the same horrid smell of sweat and blood from earlier, but this time it was overwhelming. He saw me. He saw me and grinned with a set of crooked yellow teeth. That smile threw me off. I thought that I was going to die, but then he turned back to the bathroom door completely, unperturbed by my presence. I was terrified and didn't know what to do. I just yelled and cried. I watched as he shouldered through the door. That was Mom's only protection. I watched as he raised the large razor that he was carrying, but obviously neglected to use properly. I watched as he sliced her open and tore her to shreds. I then heard something. The last thing I wanted to hear. It was Emily's scream coming from behind me. The large monstrosity looked up from my butchered mother and stared at my little sister. I was distraught. He stood up and quickly started walking towards us. My sis turned and ran, and I was at a loss when he bypassed me and went straight after her. Why was she still in the house? Has she not assessed the situation and run? Apparently not. And now she was dead, and I was alone. I ran after them both. I expected the man to kill her, as he had the rest of my family, but I was sadly mistaken. He grabbed her by the arm and jerked her as a way to make clear that he was in control. He dragged her through the house, I was making all the noise I could now, hoping and praying that someone would come in to my aid. He mustn't take her, not her. As he passed me, I backed against the wall and whimpered with terror. Why? He didn't respond, except by putting his free hand on my head, while Emily screamed in the other, saying, "Good boy." He gave another crooked grin and a very cold, unnatural laugh. I followed him to the door, where he dragged my helpless sister after him. He opened it, pulled her out, and slammed it shut behind him. I am now sitting in the house, with my mutilated adopted parents, shivering and whimpering with dismay. He's out there with her, doing who knows what to her, and I can't do anything. I would if I could, but I can't. I would chase after them in a heartbeat, but I can't. I sit here, looking at the front door. I look down at my paws. If only I could open doors. Unquote. Bro was a fucking dog the whole damn time. I love that upon rereading this creepypasta. It's super clear that he's a dog, like the whole way. The whole creepypasta alludes to this fact over and over again. But you maybe you'll catch on to it. Maybe some of you did while I was reading it, but maybe some of you didn't. And so, you know, it's a pretty good twist. I will say I'm kind of surprised the dog didn't try to, bite the crazy bearded man. But then again, maybe he's like a chihuahua or something, you know? I mean, he couldn't do a whole lot then, could he? But overall, it's a pretty good creepypasta, if only for that really cool urban legend type twist at the end. 9, 17, 10. Ah, now this is one of the classics. You know, I tend to say that a lot. But this one is at least a pretty good classic to me. This was one of those creepypastas that really got me from a young age, and that I enjoyed sharing around with others at the time, since I never really remember it doing much numbers. Like, you didn't really hear people talking about it a whole lot, but it was definitely one of my personal favorites at the time. The story follows a new college student preparing for his freshman year, and after he had easily gotten all his other supplies, the last thing he needed was a laptop. Only problem is he's a bit of a penny pincher and doesn't plan on spending the money he would need to toss out for a new one. Quote, "I scoured the internet for a good deal on laptops, finding none that suited my frugal habits. Classes were only 2 weeks away, and I was becoming desperate for a computer. Several days later, I saw an ad in the newspaper for a laptop that was being sold for only $600, and not too far from where I live. It was a really very nice Dell laptop too, seeming odd that it was being sold for almost $1,000 less than store price. I drove to the seller's address the following day. The house was farther out of the city, butting up to dense forest. Outside of the house was an old Chevrolet and a mess of old signs and other various vintage-looking items. I rang the doorbell, and a thin man in a flannel jacket came to the door. When I asked about the laptop, he looked almost relieved and told me that he was ready to sell it immediately. Luckily, I came with cash in hand, and after proof of good condition, I went home with the new computer." Unquote. However, as you might imagine, not everything was exactly peachy keen with this laptop. Quote, "Excited to have my first self-bought laptop, I powered it up and began uploading my own programs and applications onto it. Upon searching the hard drive, I found a folder hidden away on it, which was odd because the man selling it to me told me that the memory was wiped clean and ready for a fresh start. The folder was titled 9/17/10, presumably a date. I opened the folder, revealing 6 videos and 3 pictures. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to watch the videos." Unquote. What follows is an increasingly awful set of videos, the first being titled 001, and so on, showcasing a video shot by a shaky camcorder inside a vehicle recording a woman walking out of a bar and then getting into her car late at night. The person holding the camera then drives slowly behind her before the video ends. The next video is 47 seconds, and the camera now is on the dashboard, still following the woman's car. It's now raining. The next video, well, I'll read the quote. This was the one that got me officially concerned. The clip began from the same shaky hands as the first clip. It was now pouring rain outside of the car, and I could barely make out a figure in the fur coat with an umbrella walking to the front door of the house. I could only assume who this person was, and whose house this belonged to. The figure entered the house and closed the door. The following stillness greatly unnerved me. The only thing that could be heard was the sound of rain dumping on top of the car. After roughly 2 minutes of this nerve-wracking nothingness, the lights inside the house cut out. Another minute or so went by, before the camera was placed onto the console again, and the sound of a person exiting the car broke the stillness. After the car door quietly closed, another figure, this time hooded, could be seen walking towards the house. I began to feel a knot tightening in the bottom of my stomach as the stranger walked around to the back of the house. Whoever this person was, they definitely weren't supposed to be there. After another couple seconds, the lights to the outside of the house cut out. It was pitch black, and only the rain alerted me that the camera was still rolling. The video ended after about 9 minutes of rain and darkness. I was now pretty sure that this was not an innocent little project or anything of that nature, and I began to feel stupid for not checking this laptop's seller's credibility. Was this person stalking the woman the same person that I met with earlier? Throughout the whole experience, I had a dormant thought in the back of my head to call the police, but I wasn't ready just yet. Reluctantly now, I began the fourth video, 004. It was dark again, but the rain had stopped, and I was left with only silence. Not long after the clip began, I could make out the sound of footsteps on the gravel, getting louder as someone was approaching the vehicle. The car door opened and the dome light was turned on. I could tell that the camera was now on the floor of the car, pointing up towards the roof. I heard some fumbling in the background, and suddenly a thump sounded from the back of the truck. An arm abruptly obstructed the camera's view, and a large tarp could be seen being pulled out from the car. I had only one scenario running through my head, and I hoped it wasn't true. The person picked up the camera and put it back onto the console and began to back up. They drove for a good 3 minutes before parking in a branched off road and exiting the car to work on the load that they were carrying. 6 minutes after, the car was moved again to a different location, and the camera was picked up and carried underhanded away from the car. I could see now that it was the same shit bucket truck that was in the front of the Cellar's house. I was about ready to call the cops on this creep when the camera turned towards the house. It was a completely different house than the one I just visited. I was a little relieved by this, though it didn't prove anything. As the fourth video came to an end, I was wondering whether or not I was prepared to see what came next. I could only hope that this was a prank, or at least had a happy ending. 005 began inside the house. It was extremely dark, and the only thing I could make out was a figure that would occasionally walk in front of the camera. It was also quiet from the first few moments, minus the occasional barking of a dog outside. Eventually, a small sound started to appear. The small sound soon escalated to a loud, muffled scream. Shaking and struggling sounds became more apparent as time went on, as well as crying. A light abruptly came on, and the camera was lifted and panned to the center of the room, revealing a beaten and bloody woman tied to a chair. From what I could make out, this was in fact the woman from the bar. The camera zoomed in on her face for what seemed like an eternity before stopping. I couldn't believe this was happening. The original hope that this was a movie or something like that had long since diminished. With only one video remaining, I was beginning to fear for my own safety. I locked my door, closed my blinds, and pushed onward." Unquote. The first thing our narrator heard in this last video was the sound of power tools. This went on for some time until a woman in a lab coat walked into the bathroom, which the camera now sat in, and dragged a garbage bag in there with her. Quote, "Felt like I was dreaming. It was like I was watching a horror movie unfolding on the screen. She lifted the bag up from the tub, now empty, except for whatever entrails still dropped out. She picked up the camera and placed it on the ground facing the tub. On the floor in front of the bathtub was an assortment of corrosive substances and several other empty containers. The woman began to dump the liquids into the tub, which was followed by an awful noise that I can only describe as pop rocks mixed with coke. The video ended and I was left bewildered and panicked. I finally opened the pictures. The first was a picture of the truck. The second was a picture of the girl tied up before she was beaten. And the third picture brought up a corrupted file notice. But maybe that's a good thing. I managed to keep the 2 pictures before I handed the laptop over to police. I was reimbursed my $600 along with a bonus. Apparently the victim was the young girlfriend of the older woman's ex-husband. The older woman was arrested almost a year before, but was freed of all charges due to a lack of evidence. And the ex-husband was incarcerated instead. I guess this was the missing link. I hope this has solved any unanswered questions, although I'm not sure who the man in the flannel jacket was, or how he got a hold of the laptop, or how he owns the same truck as the murderer. I guess I'll just leave that to the police. Unquote. And that's 9/17/10, and I still to this day really love this one, mainly for how simplistic it is. I've always loved the idea of a horror film where the found footage part of the story is completely from the perspective of the serial killer. And it's why pastas like these, or even YouTube channels where people record and watch people, always send a distinct shiver down my spine, as there's something just so disturbing about the idea of seeing the perspective of a would-be killer hunting their victim. It's an ominous look into the hands of ultimate fate, I suppose. And this one is for sure up there as one of the first online things that got me to realize how personally terrifying and interesting I find this particular horror scenario. I found a hidden door in my cellar, and I think I've made a big mistake. So this one's pretty short and simple. A dude and his wife moved into a new house that has a cellar where they keep all their wine. It was one of the reasons they bought this house in particular, because the wife liked the idea of having a wine cellar, but eventually they kind of stopped using it. A while later, the two of them go down there and notice something strange with one of the walls. It's got a hole, and what's more, peeping through the hole reveals an entire new area of their home. A staircase that went further down in such a way that actually didn't really make sense architecturally, since it would more than likely cut into their neighbor's own cellar. Well anyway, our narrator eventually breaks down the wall and goes down there to investigate what it's all about. What he finds is a dark room covered in old blood, as well as a man who moved his limbs as if he didn't actually understand how one moves. In fact, as soon as he caught wind of him being down there, the thing started running at him backwards. Our protag escapes just in the nick of time though, and alerts his wife and calls the police. When they get there, they find no trace of the man thing, but do notice that the back door is open. So whatever it was is gone now. Our protag ends the story knowing he made a massive mistake, as whatever that thing was, someone locked it up for a reason, and now it's on the loose. And that's the story. It's not bad, but also kind of a little predictable and ends way too quickly, I feel. I feel like it would have at least made some sense if there was a follow-up where the man thing comes back or something like that. Maybe they do some research on who owned the home in the past and find out some stuff. Something. But, oh well. Moving on. Red Bull gives you wings. Now this is an obscure fucking pick, especially since the official post, as far as I can tell, only has 14 upvotes on the No Sleep subreddit from over 4 years ago, and the only reading that I could find of it on YouTube was from Dave the Useless, which opens with this.
Oh, sugar. Oh, honey, honey. You are my candy girl. What? Wait, what? We already did that one before? Ah, shit. Oh well. At least I tried. Just kidding. I didn't try at all.
Yeah. So, with that said, what's this story about? In short, it's about a guy who drinks some Red Bull from a mysterious and shady cellar, grows some weird lump-like sores on his back, and is in constant pain until they pop open and he grows wings. The end. It's a little longer and drawn out, of course, than what I'm letting on, but that's the gist of it, and nothing else really happens. So I guess it's just, if Red Bull actually gave you wings, I guess the Creepypasta's idea is that it would be painful. So I guess the title is apt. Red Bull gives you wings. You'll never even know. This one has an interesting concept, and starts with the following paragraph. Quote, surveillance is a growing fact of life these days, but I now believe we've expanded the scope of human sight to dangerous levels. I'm not a master hacker by any means, but I was definitely able to Google a script to break into my neighbor's new smart home system. Believe me when I say that ignorance is bliss, and that you can never go back once you know the truth. Unquote. From here, the creepypasta follows our narrator as he notes how a neighbor of his was talking about his new security camera system that he had installed, and how it's top of the line and that it was perfect security. This statement makes our narrator scoff and laugh, as when he looked it up, he found at least a dozen different scripts that could be used to hack into their system and have access to all of the camera feeds. Well, while hesitant at first, let's just say that curiosity and perhaps just plain being a nosy neighbor got the best of him, and he decides to hack into their system and see what life is like in that house. Quote, I told myself I'd take one quick look and then be done with it. While loading up the script, I promised myself I'd delete it right after. Yeah, that was the right thing to do. No harm done. And if I got caught somehow, I could just explain it as a one-time accident. That sounds reasonable. A black window scrolled text down my screen rapidly for 6 seconds, and then I was in. Nerves thrilling, I watched breathlessly through a security cam feed in the living room as the girl came in, greeted her brother and father, and then headed upstairs. It was definitely the same girl I remembered, and she definitely had gotten absurdly pretty in the last year somehow. After settling into certainty, I closed the feed, deleted the scripts, and then spent a paranoid hour clearing my computer of any evidence of what I had just done. For maybe a week, I sat at home terrified that the police would break into my door and tase me at any moment. But that's the funny thing about temptation. When no consequences followed, the urge to look began eating away at me. I had a few drinks one lonely night and then went for it before I could change my mind. The son was watching television in the living room. I couldn't see what he was watching from the angle of the camera in the living room, but he seemed zoned out. My neighbor himself was sitting in the kitchen working on his laptop. Again, I couldn't see what he was doing from my angle, but he was certainly downing coffee as he worked. My pulse quickened as a hallway feed caught the daughter going from her room to the bathroom in just a towel to take a shower. Okay, borderline creepish, I told myself, but it's not like I could see in the bathroom or the bedrooms, right? Just to confirm that I couldn't, I tried various devices around the house that the neighbor had connected to the system, end quote. So, kind of a creepy protagonist we have this time around. But all the same, he continued looking through their camera feeds until something extra strange caught his eye. A camera feed into their basement, where it was nearly completely black, besides a strange gray blob of pixels that was moving about. Quote, what was I seeing? Was the sensor just defective? What device was it even part of? I managed to narrow it down to a forgotten digital clock that must have been running on batteries. But nothing about this made sense. I looked up a script to sharpen video data and I let everything run all night. In the morning I pulled myself up, got coffee, sat down at my computer, and then froze. Repeatedly I played the confusing horror the script had produced. The blur of gray and shadows had become coherent, but not in a natural way. Instead it appeared I was looking at an androgynous gray humanoid form with a pillowcase over her head. Since this was just a graphical best guess, her glitchy movement brought out severe unease and disgust in me as I watched her jerkily walk around the basement. She appeared to be able to navigate despite the pillowcase covering her face, and she even made it up a few steps towards the basement door before her random movements took her back down. What the hell was I seeing? For 2 days I watched that thing stumble around my neighbor's basement before she finally went all the way up the stairs. It was 4 a.m, and all of the 3 of them were asleep. This time she seemed to move with purpose. She was still not visible in any high-resolution camera, but I tracked her from sensor to sensor by her twitching blur. After so long watching her unfocused form, I was beginning to get the sense of where her legs and arms were by the movement and patterns of the gray. Each limb moved as if on a different conflicting joint. When she walked, it was as if her ankles, knees, and thighs each wanted to go in opposite directions, and the conflict was only resolved by odd rotations and strange body angles. Gripped by terror, I watched her slowly ratchet her way through the kitchen and towards the second set of stairs. There was no doubt in my mind that she was heading for the bedrooms. My knuckles went white as I gripped the edge of my table. Finally, she clambered up and out of sight of the sensors. I panicked. She still wasn't visible on the hallway camera, but I knew I had to do something. But what? If I called the house, they would have my phone number, and they would start asking questions as to why I called at 4 a.m. There was no way I could pretend it was random. The only reason I even had my neighbor's cell phone number was that I'd heard him say it out loud the week before on one of my feeds. Unquote. Our protagonist tries to distract the creature by throwing a quarter out at the window of a room he was currently in. But when he checked the feed again, the creature seemed unfazed. Quote, crawling back to my room, I checked the feeds. Apparently completely unperturbed by my noise, the entity had begun ratcheting her way back down the stairs. It was not fleeing into the basement. I watched as it approached the small table at the front door and began going through the mail stack there. It carefully picked out one envelope and crumbled it into oblivion in a blurred gray hand. Then it moved to the kitchen where it touched the keypad on my neighbor's laptop repeatedly for nearly a minute. What was it doing? It returned to the basement to move in lurking circles, and I sat and stared at it half awake until a shout from both my computer and my open window jolted me to full awareness. It had been my neighbor from his kitchen. He'd yelled loud enough for me to hear it for real. Stalking back and forth while on the phone, he was insisting that he hadn't sent any compromising emails. He'd been fired from his job. In the front hall, his son was busy looking through the pile of mail. He asked his sister and father repeatedly if any college acceptance letters had come in, but his father was too busy arguing on the phone and his sister hadn't seen any. But I had. What type of entity were we dealing with here? It hadn't physically harmed anyone, but it was still lurking in their home every hour of every day, and it had made invisible moves against them by sabotaging my neighbor's job and his son's college career. At long last, my neighbor seemed to convince the other end that his account had been hacked, but he was somber and concerned about how it would reflect on him at work. The son continued on his day, oblivious of the fact that his acceptance letter had come in and been destroyed. It was then that I began to think about the timeline of what had happened. I'd resisted the urge to spy on my neighbor's family for weeks. Indeed, beyond that, he'd lived there for years. If the entity had been in his basement this entire time, then perhaps they were not physically at risk. There'd been plenty of opportunities to hurt them directly. No, this was something else. This was a specter of misfortune, a curse, an information parasite. But my neighbor had not been particularly unlucky as far as I knew. Not until he'd gotten the surveillance system. A bunch of little complaints I'd heard him make suddenly began to add up. Things had been inexplicably going wrong for everyone in his family recently. Alarm clocks had been failing to go off at the proper time. Emails and texts had been a bit weird. And each of the 3 members of his household had a general growing frustration with life. It was undermining them. It was literally lurking in the basement, lurking out of sight, and sabotaging them. And they had no idea. But where had the entity come from? Almost all of the devices and cameras had been there before. The only difference is that they had been integrated. Did observation have an effect on the physical universe? I was no quantum physics expert, but I knew that observation was a crucial part of existence. Did overlapping connected layers of observation somehow enable this entity to slide into our world? When you put all the pieces together, did the whole add up to more than the sum of the parts? I began thinking of a plan of action that involves sneaking over there and turning off all their devices in the hopes of banishing the entity in their basement. But as I did so, I looked down and to the left at my cell phone. It sat quietly glowing on the table, for I had moved my hand above it and activated its motion sensor. Then I looked up and noticed the webcam above my monitor that was always kept pointed at myself. Then I looked to my right at my television, itself containing a sensor, and the game console behind it that had also had sensors to detect my motion. Microphones, cameras, everywhere. I'd applied for so many internships last summer and gotten none. I'd missed dates and lost budding relationships because of texting troubles. Everything had felt hard and difficult lately. Thus why I was sitting alone on my computer most nights. I sat without breathing for nearly 20 seconds. There would be no plan. There would be no action taken. My neighbors would have to fend for themselves. I let out my breath, put my hands back on my mouse and keyboard, and loaded up a computer game. It would look like I'd given up to anyone watching. Unquote. And that's the story of You'll Never Even Know. And I think it's actually a very different and uniquely creepy idea to have a creature that goes out of its way to ruin one's life through quiet, simple little actions rather than kill you or harm you physically. It also was a pretty decent subversion, since I'm sure most people assumed by the way the story was going that the family was keeping some inbred monster down there, or that it was a creature like the Rake coming to kill them all at some point. I also like that the protagonist is kind of a piece of shit, spying on his neighbors, and that this is how he gained this information about the, well, I don't know what you would call it, security connection beast? That is kind of the strangest part of the story. Why does having the cameras and everything connected bring out the beast? It almost makes me want to assume that the monster isn't actually real, and it's more of a manifestation of a greater metaphor. Maybe about how connecting all parts of your life to technology can allow terrible people or organizations, the beast, the ability to ruin your life. I'm not 100% sure if that's what the author was going for, but it is all the same pretty fucking cool interpretation, I'd say. And if nothing else, is a very unique concept for a creepypasta. Jason the Toymaker. Back to those tried and true slasher villain creepypastas. This one being created a bit after my time, it would seem, as while it's not new by any means, it did come out by the time I was personally taking a little bit of a break from creepypastas. I've always been listening and reading them throughout the years, but this one was written around 2015 or so, which would have been around the time I started looking into other genres, shall we say. At any rate, Jason the Toymaker focuses on an orphan with amnesia who has a bunch of toys with vague memories of their past as they see through dreams more often than not. Well, around the time they start sleeping with a particular doll in their bed, they start having dreams of being tortured, as well as others around them being tortured as well. Well, to make a long story short, these dreams and visions of the past and amnesia all sort of come to a head and are finally connected through a dream that eventually turns into reality, somehow, by a creepy-looking goth dude named Jason the Toymaker. You see, Jason the Toymaker wants our protagonist to be by his side forever, and he seems jealous of them being around their friends, adoptive family, or really with anyone else, period. With the prime example being our protagonist's friend, Daisy, who Jason the Toymaker turned into a fleshy doll. This interacting with Jason makes our protagonist realize something though, that this had happened before, that Jason was a demon that had followed them since birth, that their mind keeps repressing, and whom was responsible for killing their original parents to begin with. So after this shocking revelation, our orphan's adopted parents end up trying to save them from this Toymaker demon, only to end up being killed by him. But not before the orphan makes a deal with Jason that they will come with them if they promise to not kill their adopted mom. Well, Jason kills her anyway and then takes the orphan away to become a doll as well, because, he wasn't gonna abide by any promise, I suppose. The end. Now, I know I just skimmed through a fairly long story there, but honestly, this one's just kind of boring to me. And I really try to give things my best shot, but when writing down my thoughts about this one and trying to summarize it, nothing was clicking. It just kind of feels like a lesser Laughing Jack in a way. It's never explained why Jason is so infatuated with this one orphan since they were born. He just kind of is. And it's not in a very scary and mysterious way, just more of a, oh, okay then, I guess kind of way. Nothing is ever really explained, and basically as soon as Jason the Toymaker is revealed, everyone dies, and that's pretty much it. I'm not even sure if there's an official prequel or origin story to Jason the Toymaker. I tried looking it up, and I couldn't quite find it. I found a lot of fan-related stuff, but not from the original creator as far as I could tell. So we're left with a lot of just loose ends and really not much to go on. That said, I guess his ability or his way of killing people by means of turning them into little toys for him to play with is kind of a cool and, creepy idea, so I'll give the story that. And again, it's not the worst of its kind by any means, it's just very bland. That being said, the artist that created Jason the Toymaker seems like a pretty talented person. I mean, just look at all this art. I really dig their style, so a huge shout out to them. I may not be a fan of the story all that much, but I can appreciate a good design if nothing else. And it's certainly much more creative than our next entry. Homicidal Liu. So, things have finally come full circle. You guys remember way back on Tier 1 when we were talking about Jeff the Killer, yeah? And the other dozen times he's shown up across the iceberg, I suppose. Okay, well do you remember in that original story that he had a brother who seemed to love him deeply, and who he seemed to love back, but in the end, Jeff ended up killing him anyway? Named Liu? Well, this short story asked the question, what if Liu had survived that night? And wait for it, became Jeff the Killer too. Or as the story so eloquently names him, Homicidal Liu. Now what's funny about this story is the majority of it is just going back over certain parts of Jeff the Killer's story, but from Liu's perspective. And since he's a pretty one-note character, you already know what his perspective is anyway. If you're wondering if he did anything interesting in Juvie, or if that's part of the origin, no, not a fucking all. Then when we get to Jeff killing him, we get the details about how Louis felt. And then in the finale of the story, we see Liu waking up in a hospital, hearing the nurse say he's lucky to have survived that demon. A voice inside Liu's head tells him to kill the nurse, and so he does. And then he hides the body and walks out of the hospital. Now a killer just like Jeff. The end. I mean, wow. You know what's bad when even I had higher expectations? I thought the story would have at least been following Louis in the aftermath of what happened. Maybe trying to find his brother, Maybe he wants revenge, maybe he wants to reason with them. I don't fucking know, something somber and dark like that. But instead we get a lazy retelling of Jeff the Killer, and then Louis is just randomly a killer now, and that's it. It ends right fucking there. Really does a good job in showcasing that as bad as Jeff the Killer is, fuck me, can it be done so much worse? At least Jeff the Killer was made by somebody who was trying to tell a story. This is just being lazy now. But that didn't stop Homicidal Liu from becoming one of those famous emo boy creepypasta icons anyway. This one in particular being a testament that it doesn't take much to be part of that club. Super Mario 128. This one is an old classic creepypasta, written by the same guy who wrote the Dead Bart one, funny enough. So, is it any good? Well, it starts with the following. Quote, Mario has been a gaming icon for decades, and has been in more games than can be counted. Although no year in recent memory has gone past without some type of Mario game being released, series fans will remember the nearly decade-long drought of original Mario platformers. From 1997 to 2005, there was only one new Mario platformer released, Super Mario Sunshine. During the second part of this drought after Sunshine's release, the mysterious Super Mario 128 was the main focus of the fanbase. No concrete information was given on the game, and eventually series creator Shigeru Miyamoto claimed it had simply been a series of test concepts that were never intended to be an actual game. The mystery faded from memory as the Mario drought finally ended, and most people forgot about the game that had once been the better center of every Mario fan's imagination. Unquote. The author goes on to describe how the GameCube era was a tough time for Nintendo, how the video game market was favoring darker, more violent and mature games, and this put pressure on them to move alongside the market, or starkly go against it. According to the author, Nintendo's idea was to experiment with giving some of their franchises an edge, Mario included, with Luigi's Mansion being an example of this, while Mario Sunshine was more so made to test the waters, pun intended, to see how well the traditional approach worked. Well, Nintendo would end up suffering a fair bit more during this era and were clear losers in the console war by this point, and so a darker Mario project was cooked up, or revitalized, that being titled Super Mario 128. The author then goes on to describe how no one knows exactly what went on with Nintendo at this time, notably everything regarding Super Mario 128, but that a ROM of the game was apparently leaked online for anyone to try and play. And from here, the story is the author's recollection of the game, getting into more familiar video game creepypasta territory now. Quote, the game was clearly in early beta. The title screen was nothing but white text saying Super Mario 128 against a black background. There was no options menu or save file selection either. After the title screen, the game started. Bowser's laugh from Super Mario 64 looped in the background, while a plain text box displayed this dialogue. Mario, I have taken Princess Peach, and she will not live to see the sun rise tomorrow unless you take her place. You know what to do and where to go. Do not try and stop me unless you want to hasten her death. The game certainly was going for a darker tone. After I made the text box go away, I was thrust right into gameplay. The first thing I noticed was Mario's character model. His body was as detailed as in Super Mario Galaxy, although a little more realistically proportioned. But his head was taken from his Super Mario 64 character model. Obviously, his design wasn't finished yet. The setting was a sky level. There was some simple platforms floating in the air. The rest of the area was just blue sky and several clouds scrolling in the background. The clouds seemed more realistic than the usual cartoony puffs in Mario games. They were quite graphically impressive. There was no music or full voice samples from Mario, but there were sound effects / grunts when he jumped. The jumping was more subdued than any other Mario games. Jump as high as he usually did and had little control over his movement in the air. The different types of jumps in every 3D Mario wasn't present. I played through the level. There was nothing especially notable about the gameplay. Enemies didn't seem to have been added yet. I just jumped from platform to platform and it wasn't very challenging. As I went through the level, I noticed the graphics gradually changing. The sky became more and more cloudy until it was entirely composed of clouds. The cloud background gradually turned to a dark gray. After this, it started to rain. I reached a small platform with a toad on it. He looked like the Super Mario Galaxy model. When I landed on his platform, dialogue appeared. We don't want you anymore, Mario! You don't belong here! Just give Bowser what he wants! Die! After the text box went away, I no longer had control of Mario. Mario just stood there for a while, then turned around and walked off the platform. His body seemed to go limp as he fell. Unquote. From here, Mario falls into this real-world cityscape, where he lays there in pain and defeat. People walk by him, most ignoring him, others looking down upon him with a sort of hatred. Eventually, our narrator can once again gain control of Mario, and he explores the cityscape until he finds an out-of-place house. When he approaches the house, it has the title of House of Torn Memories as its level title. When he enters the house, one of the first things he finds are two children's skeletons on the couch next to one another, in front of a broken TV. Then a hyper-realistic Bowser jumps up from the floor. Okay, to be fair, the author doesn't call it hyper-realistic, it just happens to be a good description for what he looks like in the game. Quote,
"You've been keeping me waiting long enough, Mario. I will taste flesh soon. Will you finally surrender, or does Peach have to die?"
I still didn't have control. Mario just stood there, shivering for several seconds before nodding his head. Bowser impaled Mario with his claws. There was no blood, but it was clear from the animation and sound effects that the sharp digits of Bowser's hands had gone through Mario's body. In one swift motion, Bowser dragged Mario up to his face and bit his head off. Again, there was no blood or graphic details left behind on Mario's neck, just Mario's character model being destroyed. The screen faded to black. In white text, another level name appeared: Mario's Eternal Home. Mario's character model was whole again when the level started. It was the only thing on the screen besides the black background. It was floating as if in space. I could somewhat control it, but it felt more like I was deciding the general direction in which Mario would tumble than fully controlling him. As I drifted towards no apparent destination, voices faded in. They were echoing, deep voices telling Mario that he was worthless, that the world no longer had any use for him, and everyone would be better off if he was dead. High-pitched crying was layered onto the voices after a bit. It sounded like it was supposed to be Mario's cries. This really disturbed me, and I found myself fighting back tears. For reasons I couldn't understand, this was affecting me on an emotional level. The voices and aimless wandering went on for several minutes until I spotted a light gray speck in the distance. I moved towards it. It took a very long time to reach and grew closer, at a much slower rate than it should have. When I was close enough to make it out, I saw it was a tombstone. It was a very plain one with cracks in several places. When I got right next to the tombstone, I could see the writing on it. I turned off the system right after reading it. I am not going to play the beta or hack or whatever this was again. There was a single word written on the tombstone: innocence. Unquote. And that's the story of Mario 128. Funny how the author really likes ending stories with ominous tombstones, huh? But yeah, it's alright. I mean, is it the best? No. Is it scary? Not really. To me anyway. But considering the absolute shit we've read connected to Super Mario on this iceberg, this isn't too bad. Which is a lot more than what I can say about our next entry. Time Travel Journal. Okay, so I'm going to attempt to read this in full. I don't really want to analyze it, because if I do, I'm pretty sure the brain rot that I would get from doing so would finally reach my central nervous system. So, with that said, allow me to present to you one of the absolute worst of the worst. The cream of the crop. Quote, January 9th, 1987. What was it tomorrow? I venture in the cave. I don't know what to expect, but if anyone finds this journal, I'm dead. John Terry missing since 1987. Journal entry number 1, January 3rd, 1792. I'm finally in a new state. I just can't wait until I finish my log cabin. Journal entry 10. It was a monster that killed my mother. A monster, I tell you. It had giant eyes, long legs, and a heart on its head. But it had no head. It's just not there. Jackson McCarthy died due to severe mauling and blood loss. January 1st, 1733. I saw something in the woods. I went to investigate. I heard a scream, something I had never heard before. It sent chills through my spine. It jumped at me. It ripped my arm clean off. The pain was horrible in ways I cannot describe. I ran to the nearest town in New York. I know I'm not gonna make it, but I will never forget what I saw. I call it the Shinger! Marcus Matt Thing died by blood loss January 5th, 1700. Something terrible happened. The people on board the McCarthy were found dead. I saw something crawl out of the ship, something I saw in England, but I must be just paranoid. I should just get to sleep. John Doe missing since he went on a hunting trip. January ? 1899. I'm going to die today. I'm going to shoot myself. Better to die than that beast. If you were reading this, tell Lisa I love her. Jack Adams died of self-exit the game. All of the men who died were in their 40s to late 50s, so I know I'm gonna die because of Doe. Goodbye, cruel world. Bang, bang! Oh no! Clashing! Matthew Torrin died by ? Unquote. I hope to our merciful God that this was just a troll pasta. Because if it isn't... yeah, we're moving on. Blind Maiden website. So this one's a bit of an urban legend website of sorts, and very short, so let's read it in full. Quote, there's a website that offers its users the choice to experience the ultimate horror. This website's called blindmaiden.com. Is supposedly a site dedicated to a doomed spirit that will enter the home of people who have viewed it. However, no matter how hard you try, your browser won't allow you to enter the site. You see, to access the site, you must wait until exactly 12 a.m., making sure that the night in question is a new moon night. You must be on your own in your home, with all the lights turned off. Only when these conditions are met will you be granted access to the site. As soon as you enter, you will see a montage of pictures being displayed quickly. These images are of boys and girls without eyes, and faces that are twisted in tremendous fear. After that, text will appear on the monitor saying, this website will take you to a whole new level of horror. A horror that will use all 5 of your senses. You must be very careful not to click on anything by accident. You will be faced with a real experience of absolute horror. Click the accept button to engage actively in the experience. If you click decline, you will be rewarded with access to the entire archive of those gruesome images. A gore site pretty much. Click accept, however, and there will be no turning back. You have sealed your fate, and trust me, you will experience the ultimate horror. Upon accepting, you will see a sinister silhouette walking towards your home on your monitor. The spirit will then approach and enter the same room that you're in. You will then see your own back on the monitor, and you will feel the presence behind you. Suddenly you will feel somebody tapping on your shoulder, and as you turn around, you will see the blind maiden's face and scream in terror, and that will be the last thing that you will do, as she will then kill you. The blind maiden will then pluck your eyes out and take a photo of your face. Congratulations! You have successfully completed the ritual. As a reward, that photo will forever be a part of the website's picture gallery. just like all the other photos of people who were stupid or curious enough to press the accept button. And yes, if you are a thrill seeker, then you will love the last few moments of your life, unquote. And that's the story. A pretty short and simple, but a fairly creepy concept all the same. I'm always a sucker for website-based stories and urban legends, be they simply about a strange group of fetishy creeps, or something ground in dark reality, or something like this which is just purely paranormal. So, not too bad. The worst experience to awaken to. This one yet again seems very obscure. You can always tell when this is the case when looking up to see if any of the many creepypasta YouTubers have read the story. It yields little to no results. That's when we got ourselves a certified underground pasta, though I make that sound a lot cooler than it actually is though. Anyway, this pasta is actually pretty fun and creepy. It opens with our narrator trapped in the web, upside down in some dark, dank basement. He struggles to get free, but just simply can't, which is freaking him out more and more as the seconds to minutes roll by since he's claustrophobic, and I mean, it's just kind of a fucked up place to be in anyway. Well, it's then that a strange woman walks down the basement stairs and is soon revealed to be the woman he was hitting it off with over coffee the other day. They end up going to her place and did the deed, but then he fell unconscious. Turns out she is actually a giant crazy spider woman, but one that believes he would be the perfect father to her children. So she shoots a tube down his throat and puts all her eggs inside him. After what can only be described as upside down, tied up, male preggers constipation spider diarrhea, he does end up birthing the creatures somehow. And when he wakes up after the long several days of it feeling like there was a cacophony of legs tearing at his insides, he's now free. And when he goes to leave the basement, he finds a room full of spider children, all covered in goo, which all immediately run to him, hug him, with real love for their new father, to which our narrator notes that he guesses that today is his first real Father's Day. The end. Short, very gross, but the ending really sold me on it since it's weirdly wholesome. Well, you know, when you get past the whole spider woman rape, the upside down, tied up male preggers constipation spider diarrhea, and just general fucking grossness of the story, it does have a dark comedy edge to it that I kind of dig over it taking the concept fully seriously. Not bad. The Boy Who Loved to Read. Once there was a boy who loved to read. He read everything he could get his hands on and loved going to his favorite bookstore. One day the boy realized he had read everything the store had to offer. He confronted the owner and asked him if he had anything the boy had never checked out. The owner said, "Why, yes, I do," and pulled out a book called Death. He gladly sold it to the boy at the discounted price of $50. However, he warned the boy never to read the front page. Well, the boy returned to his house and read the book, and he was content. However, he always wondered what could be on that front page. It was always in the back of his mind, until one day the temptation was just too much for the boy to bear. And so he flipped to the very front of the book and dropped the book in horror. There, in bold print, was MSRP $7.99. World's Best School Psychologist. So this one's unlike any other we've seen on this iceberg thus far, and it really went in a direction I wasn't expecting. So the story starts with our protagonist noting the following, quote, "When I was 12, I came to the conclusion that everyone in the world, including my own family, was against me. I was never a problemed child, but my parents sure treated me like one. For example, I used to need to be home by 5 p.m. every day. This clearly restricted my amount of playtime outdoors. I wasn't allowed to have friends over to play at the house, nor was I allowed to go over anyone else's. I had to finish homework directly after I came home from school, no matter how long it took. My parents refused to buy me video games and forced me to read books and then write a book report on them to prove I actually read it. Now, even though those rules listed above were quite frustrating to me as a child, they aren't what upset me the most. What really hurt me was the lack of compassion on behalf of my parents. My mother was a bitter woman who always made me feel guilty of accidents or mistakes I've made. My father only knew one emotion: frustration. The only time he spoke to me was when he screamed at me for receiving poor test scores, or beat me for misbehaving. But enough about them. Let's talk about my school psychologist. And for his own privacy, we will call him Dr. Tanner. Unquote. From here, our protagonist talks about his interaction with Dr. Tanner, and how he tells him all his issues that he has with his parents and how they treat him. And Dr. Tanner then says the following, quote, "You know, I'm the best school psychologist in the world. I promise we will fix this." I rolled my eyes. "Okay, but how?" I asked. "I have my ways," he replied. "I'm a man of my word. I promise within just 1 month, the relationship between you and your parents will change for the better, forever." After a brief pause, he continued, "Although I do need you to make me a promise. You have to promise me that you'll come back to my office after school tomorrow, and that you won't tell anyone that we had this conversation today. It'll be our little secret. I promised." Unquote. Well, the next day comes, and Dr. Tanner and our narrator talk about various topics, before he is then offered a soda from Tanner, something which he nearly never got the chance to drink, so he of course took it. It wasn't long before then that he passed out, from the drugs that Dr. Tanner had put into his drink. Quote, "It took me a minute or so to adjust my blurred vision upon waking, and when I did, I had no idea what to think. I was handcuffed to a bed and my mouth was sealed with duct tape. I immediately began to panic, squirming and tugging at my cuffs, but gave up soon after. My eyes widened in disbelief after looking around the room. There were posters of superheroes pinned up on all the walls, and photographs of famous athletes on shelves. In the middle of the room was an old television and Super Nintendo, various game cartridges stacked alongside it. I didn't know what to think. Here I am in a room filled with items most kids would die to play with. I would have probably cried from joy hadn't I been handcuffed to the bed frame. My stomach sank once again as the door opened, and Dr. Tanner walked inside. He sat down on the edge of the bed. "Now, listen," he said. "Remember that I'm here to help you, and I would never hurt you, okay?" Dr. Tanner gently removed the tape from my mouth, and then the cuffs from my hands. My first instinct was to begin crying, but something about Dr. Tanner made me feel safe. He smiled at me. "You're going to be staying here for a while," he continued. "And during this time, you're allowed to play with any toys in this room while I'm here at home. But when I leave the house, I'll need to cuff one of your hands back to the bed. You can still watch the television, but I want you to only watch the news channel when I'm away." I sat in silence, still trying to process the information he had given me. "So," Dr. Tanner yipped, slapping me on the knee, "you go ahead and knock yourself out. I'll be back when it's time for dinner." He got up from the bed, walked across the room, and clicked the TV's power button before locking the door behind him. Several more minutes passed before I realized that Dr. Tanner wasn't joking. All that was left for me to do was boot up the Nintendo and play Mario until nightfall. At about 7 p.m., Dr. Tanner returned to the room carrying 2 plates of mashed potatoes and chicken strips. I finally gathered up the courage to ask him how long I'd be staying in this room. "Well, about a month," he replied, "give or take a few weeks. I just have some work I need to do." Unquote. As the story goes on, our narrator spends his time in this room, and he eventually sees that there is a statewide Amber Alert for him on the news, with several investigators looking for potential abductors. Quote, "I began to feel nauseous as a photograph of me appeared on the screen. It was my yearbook picture from last year. The captions for the photograph displayed my name and age, my school, and my town. Above my picture were alternating titles: FBI begins search for child, and kidnapping suspect unknown, and potential runaway. The live footage continued, and 2 figures I soon recognized as my mom and dad stepped up to the podium. Both appeared to have reddened eyes. Tears streamed down my mother's face as she took hold of the microphone. I never seen so much emotion come from my mother before, as she wept on live television, stuttering on sentences such as, "Please return my baby back to me," and "I'm so sorry," and "Please come home to us." When my father took the microphone, I nearly expected his attitude to be stone cold, but he too had tears in his eyes. He pleaded to the world to bring his son home safely, and lastly, begged for my forgiveness. I know I haven't been the best father, but god damn it, do I wish I had been now. Please bring my boy back. I turned the power off shortly after. My emotions were mixed, for I had never once seen my father cry. I felt miserable that my parents were being put through so much, but at the same time I felt relief. I now know how much my mom and dad love me, unquote. You might be able to imagine where this story is going next, with him being kidnapped for a month, his mom and dad realizing how important he is to them, and then eventually he goes back to them and things are better. But Dr. Tanner takes things a little further than that. Quote, "One morning when Dr. Tanner woke me before heading off to work, I noticed a stern look on his face. I also realized that it was 3 hours earlier than when he usually wakes me. You need to watch the news today. No exceptions. I want you to keep the television on all day and pay close attention to it," he stated grimly. I, of course, complied and watched him exit the room. About 2 hours later, a breaking news segment interrupted the toothpaste commercial I was watching. The title, "Human Remnants Found." Two staunch-looking men in suits stood aside one another and began speaking. "We are displeased to bring up such unfortunate news this morning regarding our missing child case from earlier this month." One of the men bowed his head, while the one speaking shoved through some papers. He continued, "Remains of a body have been found in a garbage bag beneath a highway overpass. The body appears to be that of a child, although not much of it is left. The body has been decapitated, and much has been burnt to ash and bone." The screen shifted over to a helicopter view of the freeway. Dozens of police cars gathered near the bottom of a tall overpass. The man's voice could still be heard. Within the bag, police found a junior high school identification card labeled as such. The screen showed the school ID card I always kept in my backpack. The plastic was sort of melted away, but my photograph and name were intact. After the two men dismissed themselves, the camera panned over to my parents. They were sitting among reporters. My mother's face held a painful grimace, and my father sulked his head down at his knees. I shut off the television. Dr. Tanner returned home very late. He hurried into the room, unlocked my cuffs, and placed a bottle of fizzing water into my hand. He placed his hands upon my shoulders and smiled. "I made a promise, didn't I?" I nodded, tears squeezing their ways out of my eyes. "You need to make me a promise again," he whispered. He told me that I needed to drink all the water in the bottle. It would help me sleep, and that from here on I am never to tell anyone that I ever met him. I promised. "I told you, I'm the best school psychologist in the world, didn't I?" And he was right. I awoke later that night to find myself lying in the middle of a park, stars shining brilliantly across the night sky. I recognized the park. It wasn't too far away from my school, a mile or so down the road. I saw my house. The lights were off inside, but I could still make out my father sitting on the step leading to the front door. I hesitantly called out to him. He lifted his head slowly, but when he saw it was me, he sprang to his feet, ran towards me, arms open, yelling my name. My mother erupted from the house behind him. Dr. Tanner was right. My parents smile more often and treat me lovingly. I could not have asked for a more perfect ending. Every now and then I see Dr. Tanner on campus, talking to and from his office. Rarely do we ever make eye contact, let alone speak to one another. But sometimes he'll shoot me a wink and a smile. I'll always keep my promise to him, to pretend I never met him. But there will always be the one question forever floating in my mind. Who did Dr. Tanner decapitate and throw off the overpass? Unquote. And that's the story of the best school psychologist, and boy, is it a strange one. It's kind of a creepypasta with a sweeter ending to some degree, relatively speaking, since I'll be honest, I kind of was expecting Dr. Tanner to eventually find an excuse to keep our protagonist there with him, and that he would eventually kill the kid's parents or something like that. I don't know, something of that sort. Him being played totally straight is actually a pretty good subversion in of itself. Well, except for the part that he did kill somebody, for added effect on the parents, I suppose. I guess it kinda goes with the cartoonishly forward approach of Tanner. Instead of talking with the parents or solving the issues, why not just simply kidnap their child so they are forced into caring about him? Why not kill a child so that they think their child is dead, so when he comes back, they love him even more, thinking that they lost him forever? Though, that last part, it does feel a little extra, since I'm sure just the kidnapping would have sufficed. Plus, they gotta wonder, where was their son? Who was the kid that they thought was him? Why was his ID on the dead child? What if his parents just get mad at him even more because they assume that he ran away from them? What if it only serves as a good justification for the parents being even more strict to him? Dr. Tanner would have had to have made up a pretty good story for a protagonist to tell, to keep up this lie or some kind of way of keeping the peace around there. And even if he did escape the clutches of a madman as a cover-up story, wouldn't the police be interested in talking to him, since there is at least one dead kid in the area right now that just so happens to have our protagonist's school ID on him? Isn't that a little suspicious? Wouldn't that actually cause a lot of fucking trouble for our protagonist, potentially? I guess what I'm saying is there's a ton of jumps in logic for all of this to work out as a story that it seems to want to tell. It also kind of has that whole, I don't know, childhood fantasy of running away from home and then your parents like really being worried about you and then completely changing when you get back home. It is kind of childish in that way, and maybe that was on purpose, but I don't know, it just doesn't really click with me. But as it stands, I like the concept, but I think it needed a little bit more time in the oven. Happy Sun Daycare. Maybe I'm just growing more cynical as this tier goes on, but this is legit one of the most boring creepypastas I've read in a while. It's about a guy who's interviewing people who used to work at a daycare called, Happy Sun Daycare. And by some coincidence, the daycare just so happened to be holding a dark secret. That secret being that one of the employees was a werewolf. And there was a room with a gray door that they would put children into if they were bad, so that they could get scratched up by said werewolf. That's the whole story, basically. I know I'm not really doing it justice here by just summarizing it so quickly like that, but again, there just wasn't much going on with this one. I think what made it so boring was the way the story was delivered. That being through our narrator interviewing people and the interviews always going the exact same way. Something like this. How was it like working or being a kid at the daycare? Oh, it was perfectly normal. Pretty boring, honestly. Huh, okay, so it's pretty normal and boring, honestly, okay. Well, did anything weird happen? Oh, well actually yes, let me tell you about the shadiest shit ever in the most melodramatic fashion I can possibly muster. By the third time this exact exchange happened, I laughed out loud because by then, he's talking to a person who had went to prison and is now crying over the darkness of that gray door's content. Before that, he was talking to like a nanny of the place who was talking about how things were normal and it was a pretty easygoing job. You know, other than the fact that children were constantly getting scratched and harmed there and they had no idea who was doing it. There are cries and roars of some kind of beast which haunts her to this very day. So I wasn't much of a fan of this one. But hey, I guess at least it's about a werewolf. You very rarely see stories about them in creepypastas, so there's that, I suppose. I taught creative writing, and 2 stories stood out to me. Now this is a good fucking creepypasta. Before this iceberg, I had once again never read this one before, but I'm glad that I did, because it has so many of the elements that I personally enjoy in a creepypasta. An interesting protagonist / narrator, or at least one that has an interesting perspective. A good creepy hook and mystery to uncover, twists and turns, and some ominous ambiguity that leaves you pondering the story after. It opens with the following, quote, "Fresh out of college, I took a teaching job in a small town in central Wisconsin. In my sophomore creative writing class, I assigned a flash fiction exercise around Halloween. We'd studied urban legends and folklore, and it was the students' turn to construct stories of their own. Assignment link 100 to 1,000 words. Directions? Scare me. The submission quality was to be expected. These were sophomores after all. But one story stood out halfway through my stack of papers. A piece by a quiet student named Jake. His first-person flash fiction seemed so real, like it was dipped in reality, a little too closely. Almost like he wasn't making it up, but had been retelling something that happened to him. I put it aside, impressed. Kate's submission was the last paper in the stack. I remember reading the experience vividly, the beads of sweat accumulating around my temples, the clickety-clack of the red pen in my hand, and a weird feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach. I placed it on top of Jake's story and I thought, what the hell am I going to do? I still have photocopies of the original stories and I often wonder, why do I still have these? But there is something about them. They are so interconnected, and there is something so raw and beautiful about them. I have a strong affinity for interesting student writing, and it'd be a shame to let the flames of these stories be extinguished. I'll share the student pieces and the subsequent events that transpired right here. I do enjoy a good story, unquote. From here, we are presented with a story entitled Jake's Flash Fiction. And it follows the tale of when he and his family would go to visit their grandma Rosie at the nursing home. She would always stare out the window, come spring or snow, with big bulky headphones attached in onto her radio, which was always turned on to the station 89.1, which was nothing but static, something which kind of worried Jake. This all came to a head when, quote, "I visited one day to drop off a box of chocolates. Grandma Rosie rocked slowly in her chair, with large headphones over her ears, staring out the window, watching the snowfall. I couldn't tell if she knew I was there. I walked over and placed the chocolates on the small table, and her hand suddenly reached across and snatched my wrist. Shh, she whispered. Listen. Grandma Rosie leaned in close, and I put my ear to hers. I lifted up the cup of her headphone and listened. There was only static. I was about to speak, but she covered my mouth with her hand. Listen closer, she said. I did, but all I heard was more static. Soon they will come, she said. They will come and to take me away. This freaked me out a little, and I went home and I told my mom and dad about what happened, but they didn't think it was all that weird. I kept thinking about it. One night I couldn't sleep, so I buzzed my friend Abby on our walkie-talkies. She lived across the street and somehow she knew all about Station 89.1. She told me it was an old legend in our town, and you needed two things to explore the legend further. A radio and a closet with a door slightly open. Face away from the closet, tune in to 89.1 and listen very closely. At some point through the static, you'll hear the faint sounds of an organ, distant screams, and the dragging of metal chains along a gravelly surface. The open doorway is an invitation. Keep your eyes closed, and only if you keep your eyes closed, a figure will appear and drag you into the closet. From there, your fate is unknown. How do you know this? I asked. I've heard about it, she said. Don't tell anyone. The less people that know, the better. I looked out my window and saw Abby in her bedroom. She put her finger up to her lips. It's our secret, the walkie-talkie buzzed. For the next few days, I kept thinking about the ritual and Grandma Rosie. Why would she be playing this game? Why did she want to be dragged into an unknown fate? I again told my parents that I was worried about Grandma Rosie. They were very dismissive. Ever since Grandpa died, I think she just wants to let go, my mom said. She wants to be with him. I wanted to know more, so I decided to try the game myself. It was late at night, and I opened my closet door just a crack. I sat on my bed with my back to the closet, tuned my radio to 89.1, and put on my headphones. I heard the static, and I closed my eyes. I sat there for a long time, focusing very hard on the static. The longer I sat there, the more I felt like my room was shrinking. Kind of like the space was filling up with something else. Like I wasn't alone. In my headphones, I heard the distant organ, and I heard the screams that seemed far away, but sounded like they were getting closer. The screeching of the metal began, and then I heard a voice. "Open your eyes!" I jumped from my bed, very startled. Abby was laughing hysterically through the walkie-talkie. I looked around my bedroom. I was alone. I looked out the window and saw Abby, smiling and giggling. She brought the walkie-talkie up to her mouth. "I totally scared you," she said. "There's no one there. You're such a wuss." I noticed the closet door was wide open. The static of 89.1 hissed from my headphones. "I was only joking," the walkie-talkie chirped, but I wasn't so sure it was a joke. Grandma Rosie died 2 weeks later in her sleep. Her time had come, and I was done fooling around with legends and superstitions. Unquote. The story obviously impressed our primary narrator, since it had a mysterious legend, sentimental characterizations, and an ambiguous ending. And he thought that it was all made up, fiction, until he read the second story, Kate's flash fiction. Quote, "Panic. Fear. No one would believe me, not ever. I told him I was joking about everything. It helps me sleep at night. But I know what I saw. A young boy, a ritual, and death. Death itself, a black death with a clutching grip, an entity that surrounds its victim, dragging a companion to its secret and eternal lair. But I was joking all along, which made it okay. I had to know more. I went to her room. It felt recently vacated, like the plug had just been pulled from a sink. Headphones on the floor. Static. Nothing but static. Noises from the closet. Labored breathing. Fingernails squeaking on the door from the inside. I clutched the handle. Something else. Something dark. Can't open it. Won't open it. Refuse to let it out. I slowly back away. A tiny voice squeaking. "Help me." Static echoing in the small room, nothing but static. I closed the door on my way out. Won't let it out. Won't tell. Will never tell. My story doesn't exist. It's simply not there. It's nothing but static. Unquote. This seemed to be two stories that were very much intertwined, as our narrator notes. Quote, "This seems real. A few days after Halloween, I kept Kate after school. I wanted to know more. Specifically, was she the Abby character in Jake's story? And was she confessing to visiting the grandmother in her own piece? I pulled out Kate's flash fiction. I asked her how she wrote it. What was her inspiration? She shrugged. I guess it's avant-garde. I was just experimenting with ideas. Did you like it? I nodded. It was an interesting piece, I told her. Have you ever heard of 89.1? Kate asked me. I started to speak but couldn't. A few words sputtered out, but were interrupted by Kate's laughing. Oh my gosh, Mr. Patrick, the whole thing was just a joke. Kate explained how she and Jake conspired to write multiple viewpoints of the same story, partially as a creative writing exercise, but mainly just to screw with me. The whole thing was made up. It was a Halloween prank. We so got you, Mr. Patrick, Kate laughed. I smiled uncomfortably. It was a good one. And yes, they got me. I told her that I enjoyed her piece. Let's continue developing your avant-garde writing and enjoy your Halloween. But something didn't feel right. I had drinks with a veteran, freshman English instructor, me the first-year teacher in a new town, and he, the wily old mentor. I told him about the assignment and the stories Jake and Kate turned in. He laughed and thought about it a bit more. That just seems off, he said. Did Jake and Kate conspire to play a joke? They were thick as thieves in my class at the start of the school year. But in the fall they stopped talking, wouldn't even look at each other anymore. Had some sort of falling out. I guess they made up, unquote. For the next few weeks, our narrator watched Jake and Kate closely, both in his class and in the hallways, and they never seemed to speak once to one another, which seemed very odd, that they would then make up this prank together. Later, he would talk to Jake about how he's been enjoying watching his growth as a writer, and that Halloween flash fiction piece and prank both him and Kate did on him was great, which Jake awkwardly replied with a simple, "We got you good, huh?" Jake would go on to claim that everything in the story was made up. The grandmother Rosie, Station 89.1, etc. Quote, "I told him good job and to keep writing. Still, the situation seemed amiss, like I was missing part of the act. Was it possible that these two were so committed to screwing with me that they wouldn't even speak at school? Or maybe they were dating and didn't want anyone else to know, so they played it cool in the hallways in class? They were 15-year-olds after all. That seemed reasonable, but it was keeping me awake at night. Nothing else mattered. I taught during the day and I obsessed over the stories in the evening. News, sports, and current events faded to the background. The real world slipped away. I pushed forward. Armed with a couple of possible last names, thank you school records, I called senior citizen homes in the area. I was trying to track down my mom's old friend, Rosie, I told them. Each phone call followed the same script. The receptionist went through the files and found nothing. No one was there by either last name I had. I scoured the internet. I spent too much time in the stacks of the local library. I found no folklore or urban legends relating to 89.1. And each time I felt like quitting, I pulled out my photocopy of Kate's story. She had visited Jake's grandmother. It simply felt so real. I knew it wasn't fake! In a last-ditch effort, I spent a lot of time alone in my room, listening to the static of 89.1, with my eyes closed and the doors slightly ajar. I'd hone in on the static, and I'd listen deeply and intently for the chimes of an organ, the harsh and troubled screams in the distance, and the clickety-clank of the middle chains. Sometimes I'd think it was there, and I just had to focus a little harder, and I'd sense a presence in my bedroom, about to creep out of my closet, the dark mist waiting to drag me away. I wanted it to come, because I wanted this story to be real, but it didn't come. One day at school, I saw Jake and Kate smiling and laughing at Jake's locker. I walked past them and Kate winked at me. That was the clincher. I finally succumbed to the notion that I'd been had. It was over. I ended my search for 89.1. I had drinks again with my colleague. Many drinks, this time. And I drunkenly told him everything I'd been doing. He found my investigation ridiculous and ultimately dangerous. "You like stories too much," he said. "If I didn't know any better, it's almost like you were trying to write one of your own. Just let it go." I pulled out the photocopied stories from my back pocket, and I pressed them down on the bar, staining them with splashes of beer. My colleague picked up Jake's story and he took a look at it for the first time. His eyes skimmed the page and they stopped cold. "Wait," he said. "You never told me about Abby." I shrugged. "Abby was Kate," I told him. "It was all part of the game." "I wonder," he thought aloud to himself. He laid it out for me. A year ago, about 10 months before I moved to town, an 8th grader named Abby had gone missing, seemingly vanished into thin air. One minute she was alone in her room, and the next minute, she was gone. Some suspected that she ran away, but there were no clues. No evidence of foul play, no suspicious or shady family members or neighbors. She was simply gone. I read Kate's piece again. My heart sank. The whole time I assumed it was about her visiting the grandmother. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe the squeaks and pleas coming from the closet were coming from Abby. Kate never specified who she was visiting or where she was. I read the avant-garde flash fiction one more time. honing in on every word, just to be sure. And at that moment, everything changed. Unquote. Our narrator then spoke to the school administration and contacted authorities. However, this ultimately leads to nothing, as Jake and Kate simply say that it was all a prank, a joke, just stories. And Jake even apologized for naming a fictional character after a missing girl, and that it hadn't crossed his mind when he was writing it. Quote, "I was now the monster for dragging 2 innocent children into this mess. The staff ostracized me and the town crucified me. I was done. I left the teaching profession soon after that. I walked out of the school holding my small crate of supplies, and Kate smirked at me with a knowing glance through the first floor window. I haven't seen her since. I didn't take much with me, but I did take the photocopies of the stories. I pull them out occasionally and relive the past. And sometimes, late at night, I'll get a fire in my belly and a burning desire to travel back to that small Wisconsin town. Maybe Grandma Rosie was a great aunt that Jake's family referred to as Grandma. Or maybe it was an elderly family friend. Maybe I missed something about the missing girl, about 89.1, about Kate's intentions. Perhaps I can try the ritual a few more times, just to see what happens. Or maybe it's just all bullshit. It was 10 years ago. I'm probably the only one that thinks there's still a shred of truth in those stories. I'd be wasting my time. But it still keeps me up at night. The slim chance that it's all true. And oftentimes the idea of it is something I contemplate more than what really happened to Abby and the grandmother in the story. If it is true, why did the kids write it all down like that? I don't have a good answer. I'll never have one. I suppose that, just like me, they really just enjoy a good story. Unquote. And that's the story. And again, I really like this one. In many ways, it feels like an answer to what if, in the shower story, it was the student that had a crazy tale to share rather than the teacher. I also like that the ultimate ending is left ambiguous as to what really happened. If it truly all was just a story, or something far more sinister. It kind of reminds me of one of my favorite classic novels, The Turn of the Screw, where the crux of the mystery and possible sinister story going on is again with a teacher figure and a child, and is solely dependent on if you believe the narrator to be reliable or not. Is the narrator just a fucking whack job that looks way too far into a couple of kids' flash fiction stories? Or was there something truly more sinister going on that he just had no real way of proving 100%? Also on that note, you should totally go read or watch a movie version of Turn of the Screw. It's really fucking good. The Disappearance of Ashley, Kansas. So this one's really old and pretty simple. It's about the town of Ashley, Kansas. Well, disappearing. A lot of the story is from the perspective of the local police station as they get calls in from the town reporting a giant black hole growing in the sky. And when the police go to investigate, the one-way road to the town leads to nowhere, as if the town was completely dematerialized. And yet, they continue to get calls in from the town, from people going missing, to strange sounds, to the black hole growing larger, and this all eventually leads to fire shooting out of the black hole, and from that fire comes dead relatives from the people of the town's past, coming to visit them. And by story's end, the town is completely gone, only with a great fissure left where it once was, and no more calls coming from there anymore. Overall, not a bad little story. The Phantom Eye. I felt no pain when my right eye was taken from the socket. It happened in a flash. The doctors and my parents insisted I'd had an accident. But I had 2 eyes back then and I saw what really happened. I saw him, the Sandman. After all the visits to the hospital and all the treatments, I was fit with a glass eye. Some kids made fun of it, but I was still able to return to normal. The doctor said I wouldn't be able to ride a bike or climb trees like the other kids. I refused to believe it. I adapted quickly. I preserved and lived my life. That is, until he came back. As of late, I've been seeing things through my empty eye socket. The doctors say this is impossible, and the more experienced ones call it a phantom eye. It's much the same as when an amputee feels an itch where an arm or leg used to be. But I know what I'm seeing through that vacant socket. I recognize him. It's the Sandman. I see him through my socket all day and all night. He stands here, a lean figure with snow-white skin, beady mustard eyes, and a witchy, bird-like nose. He paces and skips and sometimes dances too. So while in my right eye life goes on like normal, in my left eye he exists in his pitch-black void. I wonder where he is, if it is a limbo of sorts, or if it is a place of his creation. If it's the latter, he made it rather dull. When I lie in bed at night, all I can do is wait. He'll be back. He will be in my room just as he was when I was 9 years old, and he will take my other eye. But the worst part won't be that I'm blind. The worst is that all I will see is him. Arizona. So this one is yet another very old one. One of the classics, you might say. But I'll admit something. This is one of the classics that I've always been kind of lukewarm on. It's not bad, just sort of random. Let me explain. See, the story is about a dude and his girlfriend who are going out to Arizona to party or whatever while they're on break. But along the way, they find that on a long stretch of nothing road that they're running out of gas and will more than likely not be able to find a gas station anywhere before they run out and end up stranded in the middle of the desert. That is until they find a gas station that seems completely abandoned in the middle of nowhere. And when our protagonist goes in, there is what looks to be a completely dark, deserted, and flooded building. He then sees a scary-looking monster in there, falls on his ass, and then runs back out to the car and tells his girlfriend to book it. When he eventually tells her, after half an hour, what he saw that spooked him, she starts crying and telling him what she in turn saw, which is weird because until now she seems sort of startled by the fact that her boyfriend wanted to leave so quickly and she hadn't really shared anything until now, but whatever. But she saw a man with a broken jaw and a little girl with a smile that stretched all the way around her whole head. And that's when the said little girl starts chasing after them with her fucking spider legs. So they keep driving and driving, trying to escape it. All the while, even though they are driving on a straight road, they keep driving by the same gas station. Then, as they're running out of gas and things seem the most desperate, they come across an old house and go in there and barricade the place. And then the guy's girlfriend keeps fucking crying and hiding in the closet. And now she seems to be turning into some kind of monster, maybe. And then the TV starts turning on and reading out all these numbers in a scary voice. And our narrator is just kind of left there totally fucked and wishing he never went into that gas station. The end. Now again, this isn't a bad story. It's very surreal, I suppose. It just has a major case of and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, with no real rhyme or reason for any of it. I do like stories where they are in a sort of endless loop of sorts, because that sense of pure dread and true despair that comes from knowing all your running away is truly fruitless and that you will run out of resources eventually and succumb to a terrible fate is very gripping and intense, and in better versions of this type of story can be seen as a metaphor for trying to escape death itself. But in this creepypasta, it all happens just so fucking fast that I guess there's no real time to linger in that dread whatsoever. So, it has some qualities that I normally like, but the execution is just kind of haphazard and just not very good. Tales from the Gas Station. For our final entry this tier, we have one that has really been long overdue on this iceberg. Tales from the Gas Station is a truly epic series that I honestly find very daunting to even consider covering because there is a lot, as in a whole book series of things to cover. So let's start with the fact that this is one of those creepypastas that moved from beyond just the internet and has paperback books for each volume. Yes, I said volume. Here is the Amazon description for the first volume. Quote, "Working at a dead-end retail job in the middle of nowhere can be hard. The long hours, the helpless customers, the enormous eldritch horror living deep below the building. As the only full-time employee at the 24-hour gas station at the edge of town, Jack has pretty much seen it all. But when he decides to start an online journal documenting the bizarre day-to-day occurrences, he unwittingly attracts the attention of much more than just a few conspiracy theorists. With the body count steadily on the rise, and a dark ancient force infecting the dreams of everyone around him, Jack will do everything in his power to stay out of the way and mind his own business. After all, he's just a gas station clerk. It's not like he's getting paid enough to wage a battle against the nightmarish aberrations plaguing his community. Besides, he already has his hands full attempting to manage all those mysterious lawn gnomes, the mutant raccoons, and the charming phantom cowboy who lives in the bathroom. Based on the award-winning creepypasta by Gas Station Jack, Tales from the Gas Station Volume 1 is a love letter to the pioneers of classic horror tailored to a generation that grew up in the era of smartphones and Wi-Fi." Unquote. If that at all sounds interesting to you, then I would highly recommend you go and try and give the series a read for yourself. Full disclosure, I have read all the first volume and a fair bit of the second one, but there is still hours worth of content that I have yet to get into. And while I would love to read it all and give an in-depth review of it, there is a limit of how much time I have if I want this iceberg to be fucking completed in any kind of timely fashion. So I wanted to bring this up here, as it is one of the more influential and interesting creepypastas that I've personally read. It's not all creepy either, as there is a distinct sense of dark humor that runs throughout the series that gives it an interesting edge. So again, if any of this sounds interesting to you, I implore you to go give it a try. There are of course plenty of readings of it here on YouTube as well, and I know you guys like watching long-form content, if you're this far into this iceberg series, so maybe it'll make a fun and creepy listen for you sometime in the future. And that is it, ladies and gentlemen, for this tier of the Creepypasta Iceberg. I do want to kind of apologize for this part taking a bit longer than the others, mainly because it is a fair bit longer than the others if you happen to notice the runtime. There was a whole joke back with my YouTube iceberg that each part kept getting longer and longer up until the last part where it got shorter again. Well, with this Creepypasta Iceberg, I'm pretty sure it's consistently gotten a little bit longer with each part. And that is partly my fault because I find it really hard to resist not adding in all these bonus entries on here. Because while the original iceberg is really good, I just know so much about creepypastas, and I know so many that I'm sure you guys have never heard of or that you would want to hear about on a Creepypasta Iceberg that's as long as this one, that I just have to add it in, which does make making these videos take a fair bit longer. That said, I do want to give you guys a heads up. There is one more part of the Creepypasta Iceberg. One left, and I want it to be a special one. It is, without a doubt, the longest iceberg part so far, script-wise, that I have ever done. With the most amount of entries, and a lot of suggestions from you guys in the comments that I have taken into account and added in. So for that reason, the last part of the Creepypasta Iceberg is going to take a little bit longer than the others, because there's a lot going into it, and there's also, I know, like, there's this whole ongoing narrative in these Creepypasta Iceberg videos, and it's all supposed to pay off with this last one. So I do have a little bit of a skit that I am setting up for the end, which is also going to take some more time. So in other words, it's going to be a little bit before that video comes out. So if you have subscribed to this channel mainly for this Creepypasta Iceberg, I apologize in advance for this one taking a little longer, but I assure you the wait will be worth it. It will be the longest part, longer than this part, and it's going to have a lot of good payoffs and a ton of the stories that I know you guys have been asking for. Some of the very best and some of the very worst. However, don't think that I've left you all out to dry. Just because this creepypasta part is taking a really long time doesn't mean there's other videos that aren't going to come out in the meantime. Stuff that isn't going to take quite as much time as this is going to. For instance, for those of you that have been watching my Internet Fable series, the kind of how I rebooted it with episode 1 being the EVGN, and episode 2 being the Richard Kuda video, which I implore you guys to go watch that one if you haven't already. The third one is going to actually be a remake of my SPAX 3 video from 2 years ago. A lot of the script and stuff is going to be the same, but there is going to be some added portions because recently there's been new videos that have come out of SPAX from the old days, and there's been more events that make me want to change the message of that video a little bit. So that one's going to be kind of a bonus video. It'll be the definitive director's cut, basically. I also have several other iceberg videos, which are just going to be one-offs, where I just do the whole iceberg in one single video for you guys as well, with some examples being the Cartoon Myths and Urban Legends iceberg, which, I mean, covers what you imagine, cartoon-related myths and urban legends. Then we have the Subliminal Message iceberg, which is what it sounds like. It's all the time subliminal messages have or have alleged to be used in TV, movies, advertising, video games, music, all sorts of stuff. It really runs the gambit and goes from the most well-known to the most obscure, and some of it's very lighthearted and silly, and some of it's extremely dark and disturbing. Finally, in regards to icebergs, there will be a second part to the slasher movie Iceberg coming out as well. I don't know when all of these are going to be coming out. They won't be all in between, like this part of Creepypasta Iceberg and the next one, but you can expect 1 or 2 of these to maybe come out. We will see. Comment down below which one of these you are the most interested in me covering first, and I will try to take priority with that one. Finally, I do have some video game related content coming out very soon. I'm going to leave that as a surprise for now, but just know there is some retrospective / ranking type video game related stuff, which I think you guys are going to be interested in, so stay tuned for that as well. There is, of course, other things that I don't want to share just yet, but let's just say I've got pretty much the rest of this year hooked up with content, which I will slowly be revealing as these videos come out. I also want to take this time to thank all of you guys for watching through this video, and if you liked it, make sure to, subscribe and like the video. This channel has come so far over the last year, from like a 2,000 subscriber channel to almost a 50,000 subscriber channel in that time. And while that may not be groundbreaking for some YouTubers, it fucking is for me, and I am extremely proud of it and thankful to each and every single one of you. Especially to all my loyal patrons over on patreon.com, including all of my night eggs and night owlets, my great night owls, Macabre Kaiju, Ho Hot, and Medusa's Hex, and my arch owls, the amazing Alexa Light, and the Chi Vibes Zen Garden Party. If you would like to support this channel and all that I do, be sure to check out my Patreon. Patrons $5 and up get to have exclusive access to my videos at least 1 day early, though sometimes it can be a few days early depending on when the video gets done. behind the scenes content, and of course, for as low as just simply $2 and up, you get access to my Discord server, where you can chat with me personally, join in with movie nights, video game streams, and the like, and just generally hang out. But, with that said, this has been Dylan the Night Owl, flying off.